Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween fell on a Friday that year, and the whole neighborhood went crazy with decorations and kids everywhere. I had just turned 11 the month before, October 9th to be exact, and this was supposed to be the best Halloween ever, because Mom finally let me go out without her tagging along. Just me, my best friend Colin, and his little brother Jesse, who was 9 and obsessed with collecting every single piece of candy he could get his hands on. We'd been planning our route for weeks, mapping out which streets had the full-size bars and which houses to skip because they gave out those weird religious pamphlets instead of treats. Colin's mom made us promise to stay together, check in every hour, and be back by 9 o'clock sharp. We agreed to everything because we were just so pumped to be out on our own, hitting the streets with our pillowcases already in hand, ready to score the mother load. The night started off perfect. We went as a group costume. The three of us dressed up as different horror movie characters. I was wearing this zombie getup my older sister helped me with, complete with fake blood and torn clothes. Colin went as a werewolf with this insane mask his dad got from a Halloween store in the city, and Jesse was a tiny vampire with plastic fangs that kept falling out of his mouth every time he said trick or treat. We hit house after house, and our bags got heavier and heavier. The weather was cold enough that you could see your breath, and the street smelled like fallen leaves and someone's chimney smoke. Every house was lit up with jack-o'-lanterns, some of them carved into crazy detailed faces, others just simple triangles for eyes. We were laughing and running between houses, comparing our hauls, and Jesse kept trying to sneak candy out of his bag, even though we all agreed to wait until we got back to Colin's place to do the official candy swap. Around 8:30, we decided to hit one last street before heading back. Sycamore Road, the one that bordered the community playground where we played basketball in the summer. The houses there were older, kind of run down compared to the rest of the neighborhood, with overgrown yards and peeling paint on most of the porches. We almost skipped it entirely because the streetlights were dim, and it looked pretty dead, but Jesse insisted because he heard from a kid at school that someone on that street gave out king-size Snickers bars. So we went, walking down the cracked sidewalk with our bags dragging behind us, already so full they were getting hard to carry. Most of the houses had their lights off, which usually means they're not participating. But there was one place about halfway down that had a single porch light on. No decorations, no carved pumpkins, nothing festive at all. Just that one yellow bulb buzzing above a dark green door. Colin said maybe we should skip it, but Jesse was already running up the driveway, so we followed. The guy who answered the door was old, probably in his 70s, with this wrinkly face and deep-set eyes that looked almost black in the shadows. He wore a cardigan that had seen better days and house slippers, and when he opened the door, he didn't smile or say anything at first. He just stared at us for a few seconds like he was sizing us up or deciding whether or not we were worth his time. Then he reached into a plastic bowl sitting on a table right inside the doorway and dropped a handful of candy into each of our bags without saying a word. Jesse shouted thank you, his voice all high-pitched and excited, but the old man just nodded once and shut the door before we even turned around to leave. Something about the whole interaction felt weird, but we were kids on a sugar high, and we didn't think much of it. We just moved on to the next house, which had its lights off, so we turned back toward Collins Street, ready to finally dig into our loot and start the trading process we'd been waiting for all night. When we got to Colin's house, his mom had already set up the living room for us. She'd spread out a big blanket on the floor and put out 3 bowls so we could sort our candy by type. The rule was simple. We each dumped our bags out, organized everything into categories, and then we'd trade until everyone was happy. I always traded away my Almond Joys because I hated coconut, and Colin would give up his Smarties because he said they were just compressed sugar that tasted like chalk. Jesse was the pickiest. He only wanted chocolate, specifically anything with caramel or peanut butter. We started sorting, making piles of chocolate bars, gummy candy, lollipops, and the random stuff like popcorn balls or homemade cookies that some of the older ladies in the neighborhood insisted on handing out. Jesse grabbed a chocolate bar from his pile, one with a dark brown wrapper that looked like it might be a Hershey's or something similar. He didn't even ask if anyone wanted to trade for it, just ripped the wrapper open and took a huge bite, chocolate smearing on his vampire fangs. Colin and I were too busy negotiating over a pack of Reese's cups to pay much attention to him at first. Maybe 30 seconds later, Jesse made this choking sound. Not like he was actually choking on the candy, but like something tasted so bad it made him gag. He spit the chocolate out onto the blanket, this gross brown glob mixed with saliva, and his face went pale. I mean really pale, even under the white vampire makeup he was wearing. He said it tasted like soap, like really strong chemical soap, and his mouth was burning. Colin's mom came rushing in from the kitchen because she heard the commotion, and she asked Jesse what was wrong, but before he could even answer, he lurched forward and threw up all over the blanket. It wasn't just a little bit either, it was violent, like his whole body was rejecting whatever he'd just eaten. The vomit was dark and had this strange smell to it, not the usual puke smell, but something sharper, almost like bleach or cleaning fluid. Colin's mom completely panicked. She grabbed Jesse by the shoulders and asked him what he ate, and he pointed at the half-eaten chocolate bar still in his hand, the wrapper lying next to it on the floor. She snatched the wrapper up and examined it, but there was no brand name on it, just plain brown paper that looked like it had been hand-wrapped. That's when I remembered the old man on Sycamore Road, how he just grabbed a handful of candy from that bowl without even looking at what he was giving us. Colin's mom called 911 immediately, her voice shaking as she explained that her son's friend had eaten something and was now vomiting uncontrollably. Jesse kept throwing up, he couldn't stop, and between heaves he was crying and saying his throat hurt, that it felt like it was on fire. His lips started looking swollen and red, and there were these weird white patches forming at the corners of his mouth. I felt completely helpless, just sitting there watching my friend suffer, and Colin had backed up against the wall with tears streaming down his face. The ambulance showed up maybe 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. The paramedics came rushing in with their equipment, asking questions rapid fire while they checked Jesse's vital signs and looked at the chocolate bar wrapper. One of them held it up to his nose and sniffed it. Then his expression changed. He told his partner something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the word chemical. They loaded Jesse onto a stretcher and took him out to the ambulance, and Colin's mom went with them after telling us to stay put and that she'd call our parents. She grabbed the rest of Jesse's candy bag before leaving, and she took the chocolate wrapper with her. Colin and I just sat there in the living room, staring at the mess on the blanket, neither of us knowing what to say. The whole house smelled like vomit and that chemical odor, and all the candy we'd been so excited about suddenly looked dangerous, like any piece could be hiding something terrible inside. My mom showed up about 20 minutes later, her face tight with worry, and she made me show her every single piece of candy I'd collected. We went through it, item by item, and she threw away anything that looked homemade or had a wrapper that seemed off. When we got home, she called the police non-emergency line to report what had happened, giving them the address on Sycamore Road where we'd gotten the candy. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Jesse and wondering if he was going to be okay, replaying the sound of him choking and gagging in my head. The next morning, Colin's mom called to tell us that Jesse was stable but still in the hospital. The doctors had run a bunch of tests and found traces of ammonia-based cleaning solution in his system, the kind you'd use to scrub bathrooms or kitchen floors. They'd had to pump his stomach and give him medication to protect his throat and esophagus from the chemical burns. He was going to survive, thank God, but he'd be in the hospital for at least a few more days under observation. The police had gone to the house on Sycamore Road early that morning and questioned the old man who lived there. His name was Howard Pruitt, and apparently he'd been living alone in that house for over 15 years after his wife died. Neighbors said he was always complaining about kids cutting through his yard or making noise near the playground, calling them vandals and troublemakers, even when they were just playing. The police searched his house and found a whole stash of candy in his kitchen, chocolate bars that he'd carefully unwrapped, coated with a diluted cleaning solution using a paintbrush, and then rewrapped in plain brown paper. He'd made dozens of them. When the police confronted him, Howard didn't even try to deny it. He admitted everything, said he'd only wanted to teach the kids in the neighborhood a lesson, to scare them into staying away from his property. He claimed he'd diluted the cleaning solution enough that it wouldn't kill anyone, just make them sick enough to think twice about trick-or-treating near his house again. He actually seemed annoyed that the police were making such a big deal out of it, like he couldn't understand why poisoning children was considered a serious crime. The detective who interviewed him said Howard kept insisting he wasn't trying to hurt anyone permanently, that it was supposed to be non-lethal, just enough to cause discomfort. But the medical report showed that if Jesse had eaten the entire chocolate bar instead of just one bite, or if a smaller child had eaten it, the outcome could have been fatal. The ammonia concentration was higher than Howard claimed, and the doctors said Jesse was lucky he'd spit most of it out, and that help arrived quickly. Howard Pruitt was arrested and charged with attempted poisoning, reckless endangerment, and distribution of adulterated food. The news spread through town like wildfire, and suddenly every parent was in a complete panic. Within days, the local news picked up the story, and it became this huge cautionary tale about Halloween safety. Parents who'd let their kids eat candy on the walk home were now horrified, realizing how close their own children might have come to the same fate. The elementary school sent out letters to every family, and the PTA organized a meeting about trick-or-treat safety that packed the gymnasium. People started talking about only going to houses of people they knew personally, or skipping Halloween altogether next year. Some parents took their kids' entire candy hauls to the police station, where they'd set up a voluntary screening area with officers checking wrappers and looking for anything suspicious. Our local hospital offered free candy x-rays for anyone who wanted them. The whole town became obsessed with the idea that there could be more people like Howard out there, more tainted candy sitting in kids' pillowcases and plastic pumpkin buckets. I had to go to the police station with my mom to give a statement about what happened, describing the house and Howard's behavior when he answered the door. Colin and I both told them everything we could remember, even small details like the color of his cardigan and the way he'd stared at us before handing over the candy. Jesse came home from the hospital 5 days later, and when I saw him at school the following week, he looked different, thinner, quieter, and he didn't want to talk about what happened. His parents had hired a lawyer and were pursuing a civil lawsuit against Howard on top of the criminal charges. Howard Pruitt ended up pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding a trial, and the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison plus probation. The house on Sycamore Road sat empty after that, with a for sale sign in the yard that stayed there for over a year before anyone bought it. Halloween was never the same for me after that night. Even now, years later, I still think about it every October when I see kids in costumes going door to door. I think about how something that's supposed to be fun and innocent can turn into a nightmare in seconds, how someone's bitterness and anger can poison more than just chocolate bars. Jesse never went trick-or-treating again, and honestly, I don't blame him. That smell of chemicals mixed with vomit still hits me sometimes out of nowhere, and I'm right back in Colin's living room, watching my friend suffer because some old man decided that scaring children was an appropriate response to his loneliness and resentment. The whole experience taught me that monsters don't always look like the ones we dress up as for Halloween. Sometimes they're just regular people who've let their worst impulses win. We'd been in Forest View for about 3 months when October rolled around, and honestly, I was still getting used to the whole suburban thing. Our old place in Wisconsin had maybe 20 houses scattered along a county road, so this neighborhood with its neat rows and HOA rules felt like a different planet. My little brother Ethan was 11 and had already made friends at his new school, which was more than I could say for myself. High school as the new kid sucked, especially when everyone had known each other since kindergarten. But that night, Halloween night, Mom handed me a flashlight and told me to take Ethan trick-or-treating while she stayed back to hand out candy. He'd been planning his route for weeks, had this whole map drawn on notebook paper with houses circled in red marker based on intel from kids in his grade about who gave out the good stuff. He was dressed as a ninja, complete with a plastic sword and those weird toe shoes, doing these exaggerated kicks every few steps that made me want to walk 10 feet behind him. We headed out around 6:30, right when the sky was doing that deep purple thing before going fully dark. The air had that perfect autumn chill, and you could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace mixed with the sugar-sweet scent of candy. Little kids in costumes were already swarming the sidewalks, parents trailing behind with flashlights and those orange pumpkin buckets. Our street, Pinehurst Drive, curved into a cul-de-sac at the far end, and most of the houses there had gone all out with decorations. Fake cobwebs, motion sensor witches, those inflatable yard displays that looked impressive until you saw them deflated the next morning. But there was one house at the very end that was completely dark. No lights, no decorations, nothing. Just this beige two-story colonial with bushes that had grown wild enough to scratch against the windows. When we were hitting the fourth or fifth house, this woman passing out candy, maybe in her 40s with a sweater that had a cat wearing a witch hat on it, leaned toward us and said, "You boys can trick or treat anywhere you want, but skip that last house. The people there don't celebrate." The way she said it wasn't casual. It was a warning, the kind adults give when they're trying to sound calm but actually mean business. Of course, telling Ethan not to do something was basically guaranteeing he'd obsess over it. For the next hour, as we hit house after house, and his pillowcase got heavier with candy, he kept circling back to that dark house at the end. Why don't they celebrate? Are they mean? What if they're just old and forgot to turn the lights on? I tried explaining that some people just don't participate, that maybe they were religious or just didn't like kids, but he wouldn't let it go. By the time we'd covered most of the cul-de-sac and the crowds were thinning out, it was almost 8:30. The younger kids had gone home, and the teenagers who were too old to trick or treat but did it anyway were starting to roam around in packs. Ethan stood at the edge of the dark house's driveway, staring up at it like it was some kind of challenge. The house looked even creepier now that the surrounding homes were lit up in contrast. Every other porch had candles or string lights, but this one was just a black void. "Come on, Caleb," Ethan said, already taking a few steps up the driveway. "Let's just check. Maybe they left candy out on the porch or something." I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back, telling him we should respect what the neighbors said, but he shook me off. "I just want to see if anyone's home. We don't have to knock or anything." There was this weird determination in his voice that I recognized from when he'd get fixated on beating a video game level or winning an argument. He wasn't going to drop it. I figured the quickest way to end this was to just walk up to the porch, show him there was nothing there, and leave. So I sighed, adjusted my jacket, and followed him up the cracked concrete driveway. Dead leaves crunched under our shoes, and I noticed the lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks. As we got closer to the front door, I could see a faint bluish glow coming from inside, flickering like a television. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was open maybe 2 inches, just enough that you could see a sliver of the entryway inside. Ethan saw it too and immediately whispered, "See? Someone's home. They probably just forgot to close the door all the way." But something about it felt wrong to me. Not horror movie wrong, just off in a way I couldn't explain. Like when you come home and realize you left the stove on. That flutter in your chest. I told Ethan we should go, but he was already climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The wood creaked under his weight, and I followed reluctantly, keeping my voice low as I called out, "Hello? Your door's open." Nothing, just the sound of the TV inside, playing what sounded like a local news broadcast. I knocked on the door frame, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone home?" Still nothing. Ethan pushed the door open a bit wider, and the hinges made this long, groaning sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet neighborhood. The entryway was dimly lit by the TV glow coming from what looked like the living room to the left. I could make out a coat rack, some shoes lined up against the wall, normal stuff. "We should call someone," I said, pulling out my phone. Maybe they had an emergency and left in a hurry. But Ethan was already stepping inside, his ninja sword bumping against the doorframe. "Ethan, what are you doing?" I hissed, but he ignored me, moving toward the TV light like a moth. I didn't want to leave him in there alone, so I followed, my heart doing this annoying hammering thing against my ribs. The living room was small and cluttered, with a brown couch facing a TV that was playing some news segment about traffic conditions. On the coffee table in front of the couch, I saw a large plastic bowl, the kind you'd put Halloween candy in, except it was tipped over on its side. Fun-sized Snickers and Milky Ways were scattered across the table and onto the floor, some of them still in that jumbled pile like someone had knocked the bowl over suddenly. Next to the bowl was a cell phone, screen down, and the little LED light on the side was blinking red. But what made my chest tighten was the phone's camera. The one on the back was facing up and the screen, when I picked it up without thinking, showed a recording app. The timer read 43 minutes and 17 seconds. Someone had been recording. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone was doing a Halloween prank video and stepped away. Maybe they were filming themselves handing out candy and forgot about it. But the spilled bowl, the abandoned phone, the open door, none of it added up to a simple explanation. I was about to tell Ethan we needed to leave right now when I noticed the floor. There were footprints, muddy boot prints leading from the entryway past where we were standing and disappearing into the hallway that led toward the back of the house. They were large, definitely adult-sized, and the mud was still wet enough that it looked dark against the hardwood. I followed the trail with my eyes and saw they led to a door at the end of the hall, partially open. Even from where I stood, I could tell it was the basement door because of the darkness beyond it and the way cooler air seemed to drift out. Ethan had moved to the couch and was picking up some of the spilled candy, shoving a Snickers into his pillowcase like we were still trick-or-treating and this was all normal. "Ethan, put that down," I whispered urgently, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "We need to go, now." He looked at me like I was overreacting, holding up a Twix bar. "Why? No one's here, they probably went to a party or something." But I was staring at those boot prints at the basement door, and every instinct I had was screaming that we'd walked into something we shouldn't have. I grabbed Ethan's arm, probably harder than I needed to, and started pulling him toward the front door. That's when I heard it. A sound from the basement. Not a loud sound, not a crash or a voice, just breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, the kind you do when you've been running or lifting something, that wet, raspy inhale and exhale. It was coming from just beyond the basement door, down those stairs we couldn't see. And then the breathing paused, like whoever was down there had heard us moving. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. My entire body went rigid, and I could feel Ethan tense up beside me, finally understanding that something was very wrong. I didn't think. I just moved. I yanked Ethan toward the front door and he didn't resist this time, his candy bag forgotten on the floor. We stumbled out onto the porch, and I was pulling the door shut behind us when I heard footsteps, fast and heavy, coming up the basement stairs. Not running exactly, but moving with purpose. My hands fumbled with the doorknob, trying to pull it closed, but it stuck halfway like the frame was warped. Through the gap, I could see movement in the hallway, a shadow stretching across the wall from the basement doorway. Ethan was already at the bottom of the porch steps, and I abandoned the door, jumping down all 3 steps at once. We ran across the lawn, not bothering with the driveway, my shoes slipping on the wet grass. I didn't look back until we were under a streetlight 2 houses down, both of us gasping for air. When I finally turned around, the house looked exactly as it had before, dark and silent. The front door still hanging open. No one came out. No one appeared in the windows. It was like the whole thing had been swallowed back into the darkness. Ethan was shaking, his ninja sword crooked on his back, his face pale even in the orange glow of the streetlight. "Who was that?" he kept asking. "Who was down there?" I didn't have an answer. We stood there for maybe 2 minutes just watching the house, waiting for something to happen. Part of me wanted to call the cops right then, but what would I even say? We went into someone's house uninvited and heard breathing? That we saw muddy footprints and a recording phone? It sounded insane even in my own head, and I was terrified we'd get in trouble for trespassing. But I also couldn't shake the image of that spilled candy bowl, the phone still recording, the way those footprints led down to the basement like someone had been dragged. Finally, I grabbed Ethan's hand, something I hadn't done since he was little, and we walked quickly back to our house. Mom was on the porch waving at some kids leaving, and when she saw us, she smiled and asked how the hall was. I told her it was fine, that we were tired and going inside. She didn't notice that Ethan had left his candy behind, or that both of us looked like we'd seen something we couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to convince myself we'd overreacted, that maybe it was just someone doing yard work in their basement who got startled when they heard us upstairs. But the spilled candy, the recording phone, the muddy prints, they didn't fit that story. Around 2 in the morning, I crept downstairs and looked out the living room window toward the cul-de-sac. I couldn't see the house from our angle, but I could see the glow of police lights, red and blue, flashing against the trees. My heart started pounding all over again. I wanted to wake up my parents to tell them everything, but I was paralyzed by the fear of admitting we'd gone inside. Instead, I went back to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. The next morning, Ethan came into my room before school, his eyes red like he hadn't slept either. He didn't say anything, just sat on the edge of my bed. Finally, I told him we needed to tell someone, that whatever we'd walked into was serious. He nodded, and we went downstairs together to find Dad reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Before I could say anything, Dad looked up and said, "Did you boys hear about the situation on Pinehurst last night?" My throat went dry. He folded the paper and continued. "Apparently there was a break-in at one of the houses. The couple that lives there came home from dinner and found someone had been inside. Police were there for hours." I asked which house, even though I already knew. "The one at the end, the Crawfords. Wife said she'd left a bowl of candy by the door before they left, and when they got back, it was knocked over, front door wide open. They think someone was trying to rob the place and got spooked when they came home." My mind raced. That meant we'd been in there while someone was still in the basement. The homeowners had come back while we were running away. The breathing we heard, the footsteps, that was the intruder. I felt sick. Dad kept talking, saying the police were asking neighbors if they saw anything suspicious, and I knew right then that we had to tell them. Ethan looked at me, waiting for me to make the decision. I took a breath and told Dad everything. The open door, the phone recording, the muddy prints, the breathing from the basement. He didn't yell or get mad. He just grabbed his keys and told us to get in the car. We drove to the police station, and I gave a statement to an officer who wrote everything down while nodding seriously. He said the phone recording was crucial evidence that whoever broke in might have accidentally activated it. They'd already dusted for prints and were checking security cameras from other houses. A few days later, they arrested someone, a guy from 2 towns over with a history of burglaries. He'd been hiding in the basement when the homeowners returned and fled through a back window after we left. The officer told my dad that if we hadn't spooked him by being in the house, he might have confronted the Crawfords directly when they came home, and things could have gone very differently. I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. We probably saved someone from getting hurt, but we also could have gotten hurt ourselves. Ethan and I don't really talk about it anymore, but every Halloween since then, when I see a house with no porch light, I keep walking. Some doors aren't meant to be opened even when they're already cracked. The best night of my life turned into the worst in less than an hour. My 13th birthday had come and gone that September of 2016, and with it came a new privilege, trick-or-treating without parents hovering behind us. Mom finally trusted me enough to go out with just my friends, as long as we stuck together and came home by 9. Our group had 5 people that year: me, Jason, my cousin Amanda, Brian from across the street, and Lucia, who lived 3 houses down. We'd spent the better part of October planning our route, circling houses on a hand-drawn map that gave out king-size candy bars, crossing out the ones that handed out pennies or toothbrushes. Jason was absolutely bouncing off the walls because his parents had been super controlling the year before, dragging him home at 7 while the rest of us kept going. They'd finally eased up and given him the same 9 o'clock curfew as everyone else. He kept going on and on about how we were going to clean out the entire neighborhood, stuff our pillowcases so full we'd need to make trips home to empty them. That feeling of independence, of being allowed to wander the streets on our own for the first time, made everything sharper and more exciting. None of us could have imagined that before the night ended, one of us would vanish. and the rest of us would carry that weight for the rest of our lives. We left around 6 in the evening, just as the sky shifted from orange to deep purple, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. The air had that perfect autumn chill where you could see your breath but didn't need a heavy jacket yet. I dressed as a zombie with torn jeans and a shredded shirt, fake blood smeared all over my face and hands that my mom had helped apply. Jason wore this glow-in-the-dark skeleton costume that looked sick once it got dark enough. Amanda went as a witch with a pointy hat that kept falling off. Brian chose some anime character I didn't recognize, and Lucia had on a vampire cape that dragged on the ground and kept getting caught on things. We attacked the first few blocks with pure energy, racing from house to house, our bags getting heavier by the minute. Everyone was hyped, laughing about whose costume was better, comparing candy hauls, trading the gross stuff nobody wanted. Around 7:30, we hit Oakwood Avenue, this long residential street with huge oak trees that created these creepy shadows under the streetlights. Brian threw out the idea that we should split up to hit more houses before time ran out. Amanda and Lucia wanted to tackle the left side of the street, and Brian decided to run back to a house we'd missed a couple blocks earlier. That left Jason and me to handle the right side of Oakwood, with everyone planning to meet up at the stop sign on the corner in 20 minutes. It seemed like the most normal suggestion in the world, the kind of call you make without thinking it through. Jason and I worked our way down the street, hitting every house with its porch light on. We were making good time, joking around about how Brian's costume looked like a rejected comic book character, rating each house's decorations on a scale of 1 to 10. Some people went all out with fake graveyards and motion sensor zombies, while others just stuck a plastic pumpkin on their doorstep and called it a day. Around the 5th or 6th house, Jason's pillowcase ripped at the seam from all the weight, and he had to double it up inside another bag he'd brought as backup. He was grinning like crazy, showing me this massive Snickers bar someone had just given him. We had maybe 3 more houses to go before we'd loop back to meet everyone else. That's when I noticed the fire truck parked on the side of the road, about halfway down the block. It wasn't running, no lights flashing or anything, just sitting there like someone had parked it and walked away. At first, I didn't think much of it because you see emergency vehicles around neighborhoods sometimes, especially on nights like that when there's so much activity. Jason noticed it too and made some joke about firefighters probably getting called out to rescue a cat from a tree or put out someone's decorations that caught fire. We kept moving, hit another house where the lady gave us homemade popcorn balls that looked questionable, and then Jason said he wanted to cross the street to check out this one house that had this insane haunted display with animatronic ghosts. I told him we should just finish our side first and then circle back, but he was already jogging across the road, his skeleton costume glowing bright in the darkness. I went to the next house on my side, rang the doorbell, waited for this old guy to drop candy in my bag, and when I turned around to see where Jason went, I saw him standing near the fire truck. There was a man next to him, tall, wearing full firefighter gear, the heavy coat and the helmet, everything. They were talking, and Jason was nodding, gesturing toward his bag like he was showing the guy his candy or something. I figured maybe it was someone's dad who was a firefighter, just hanging out and chatting with kids, being friendly. The whole interaction looked completely normal, harmless even. I didn't feel any alarm bells going off in my head. I actually thought it was kind of cool that Jason was talking to a real firefighter. I finished up the last 2 houses on my side, which took maybe 3 or 4 minutes tops, and when I looked back toward where Jason had been standing, he was gone. The fire truck was still there, but no Jason, no firefighter, just an empty street. At first, I figured he'd just moved on to another house, or maybe crossed back to my side of the street while I wasn't paying attention. I walked toward the stop sign where we were supposed to meet everyone, expecting to see him there already, probably bragging about some giant candy bar he'd scored. But when I got there, it was only Amanda and Lucia waiting, comparing their hauls and complaining about a house that gave out raisins. I asked if they'd seen Jason, and they both shook their heads. Brian showed up a minute later, out of breath from running, and he hadn't seen him either. We waited at that corner for another 10 minutes, then 15, joking at first that Jason was probably just trying to squeeze in a few more houses before meeting us. But as the minutes dragged on, the jokes stopped. Amanda suggested we walk back down Oakwood to look for him. So we did, all four of us retracing our steps, calling his name. We checked every yard, every side street, even knocked on a few doors asking if anyone had seen a kid in a skeleton costume. Nothing. The fire truck was gone too, which I only noticed when we got back to where I'd last seen Jason. The spot where it had been parked was completely empty. Not even tire marks or anything to prove it had been there at all. We searched for another 20 minutes before Amanda said we needed to tell our parents. None of us wanted to be the one to admit we'd lost Jason, but we didn't know what else to do. We walked back to my house because it was closest, and I remember my stomach twisting into knots as we climbed the porch steps. My mom took one look at our faces and knew something was wrong before I even opened my mouth. When I told her Jason hadn't shown up at the meeting spot and we couldn't find him anywhere, her expression shifted from concerned to seriously alarmed in about 2 seconds. She grabbed her phone and called Jason's mom while ushering all of us inside. I could hear Jason's mom's voice getting louder and more panicked through the phone, asking where he was last seen, what he was wearing, who he was with. My mom tried to keep her calm, but her own hands were trembling as she dialed 911. Within 15 minutes, there were police cars on our street, officers asking us questions, writing everything down in little notepads. I explained about the fire truck, about seeing Jason talking to the man in firefighter gear, and I watched the officers exchange these quick glances that made my chest feel tight. One of them asked me to describe exactly what the man looked like, but I couldn't give them much because of the helmet and the gear covering most of his face. All I remembered was that he was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and his voice had sounded friendly when I'd heard him talking to Jason from across the street. The next few hours turned into this surreal blur of search parties and flashing lights. More police showed up, then volunteers from the neighborhood, everyone spreading out with flashlights, checking yards, garages, anywhere a kid might have wandered off to or gotten hurt. Jason's parents arrived at my house, his mom completely falling apart, his dad trying to hold it together, but you could see the terror in his eyes. They kept asking me the same questions the police had asked, wanting me to remember more details, anything that might help. I felt this crushing guilt building in my chest because I'd been right there, literally across the street from Jason when he was talking to that man, and I'd just assumed everything was fine. Why didn't I call out to him? Why didn't I cross the street to see what they were talking about? These questions hammered through my head over and over. My mom kept trying to reassure me that it wasn't my fault, that I had no way of knowing, but her words felt hollow. Amanda, Brian, and Lucia were all sitting in my living room looking shell-shocked, none of us really understanding how a normal night had spiraled into this nightmare. The police brought in dogs around midnight, and I watched from my window as they tracked Jason's scent down Oakwood Avenue, then lost it about a block past where I'd last seen him. The investigation kicked into high gear the next day. Detectives came to interview me again, this time with more specific questions about the fire truck and the man. They asked about the truck's number, any identifying marks, the color and condition of the firefighter gear. I did my best to remember, but everything had happened so fast and I hadn't been paying that much attention, because nothing seemed wrong at the time. They brought in a sketch artist who worked with me to create a composite, but since I'd barely seen the man's face, the drawing ended up pretty generic. What really broke the case open was the security footage. One of the houses on Oakwood had a camera system that covered their driveway and part of the street. The police got the footage and found the exact moment Jason approached the truck. You could see him walking up, see the man step out and start talking to him, see Jason pointing at his candy bag and laughing. Then the man gestured toward the back of the truck, and Jason walked around to look at something. The camera angle didn't capture what happened next, but 30 seconds later, the truck pulled away from the curb and drove off. Jason wasn't visible anywhere in the frame. When the detectives showed the footage to the fire department, trying to identify which station the truck belonged to, they discovered something that made everyone's skin prickle with dread. The truck had the right markings and looked legitimate, but the number on the side belonged to a truck that had been decommissioned months earlier. That discovery shifted everything. This wasn't some tragic accident or a kid who'd wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had deliberately posed as a firefighter, using gear and a vehicle that looked official enough to fool everyone, including me. The police started pulling records, cross-referencing anyone with access to old fire department equipment, checking former employees, anyone who might have had reason to own or steal a decommissioned truck. It took them 3 days to identify a suspect. His name was Vincent Carr, a firefighter who'd been suspended from a department 2 towns over for behavioral issues and inappropriate conduct. He'd been fighting the suspension, claiming it was unfair, and had been living in some rundown rental property while the appeals process dragged on. When detectives went through social media and public records, they found he'd purchased firefighter gear from an online auction site and had been seen driving a truck matching the description around his neighborhood. They got a warrant and showed up at his place on a Friday morning, nearly a week after Jason disappeared. Carr wasn't home, but they searched the property anyway and found Jason's skeleton costume stuffed in a trash bag in the garage, along with maps of our neighborhood with certain streets circled in red marker. The manhunt intensified after that. Carr's face was all over the news, Amber Alerts going out across 3 states, tips flooding in from people who thought they'd seen him. I couldn't stop watching the coverage, this sick compulsion to know what was happening, even though every update made me feel worse. My parents tried to limit my exposure to it, but I'd sneak my phone under my covers at night and read every article, every comment thread, torturing myself with what-ifs and possibilities. Jason's parents held a press conference begging for information, his mom barely able to speak through her tears, and watching that destroyed me all over again. School became unbearable because everyone knew I was the last person to see Jason before he vanished. Some kids asked invasive questions, others avoided me entirely like I carried some kind of curse. Amanda stopped coming to school altogether for 2 weeks. Brian's parents pulled him out and enrolled him somewhere else. Lucia's family moved away before the year ended. Then, 11 days after Jason disappeared, a jogger found his backpack in a drainage ditch about 5 miles from our neighborhood, out near the industrial park where all the warehouses were. The backpack was still full of candy, every piece accounted for, his name written in Sharpie on the inside flap. Police combed the entire area with dogs and search teams, but they didn't find anything else. No other evidence, no sign of Jason, nothing that explained why the backpack had been dumped there specifically. Vincent Carr was finally arrested 3 weeks later in a motel outside Cleveland, over 200 miles away. He'd been moving around, paying cash for rooms, avoiding cameras, basically acting exactly like someone with something to hide. When they brought him in for questioning, he refused to talk without a lawyer, and even then, he wouldn't say a word about Jason. The evidence against him was solid enough for charges: the costume in his garage, the truck that matched witness descriptions, security footage showing him in our neighborhood that night, his own lack of alibi. But without Jason, without a body or a confession, the case stalled in this agonizing limbo. The prosecutors worked with what they had, building a circumstantial case for kidnapping, but everyone knew it wasn't enough for the kind of justice Jason's family deserved. The trial happened about 1.5 years later, and I had to testify, had to sit in that courtroom and describe what I'd seen that night while Carr sat there in a suit, staring at nothing, showing zero emotion. The jury convicted him on multiple charges and he got 40 years, but he never admitted what he did with Jason. He never told anyone where to look, never showed a shred of remorse. Jason's parents were in court every single day, and when the verdict came down, they didn't even look relieved. How could they? Their son was still gone. The years since then have been strange. I'm in my early 20s now, graduated college, trying to build a normal life. But that night follows me everywhere. I can't go anywhere near Oakwood Avenue without feeling like I'm going to be sick. Every year when the end of October rolls around, I get this tight feeling in my chest that doesn't go away until November starts. I've been in therapy since I was 15, trying to work through the guilt, the constant replay of those moments when I could have done something different. Jason's case occasionally pops up on true crime shows or podcasts, and every time it does, I get messages from strangers asking for details, people who treat it like entertainment instead of the worst thing that ever happened to real people. His parents never stopped looking. They hired private investigators, followed up on every single tip no matter how far-fetched, kept his face on social media and missing person databases. About 6 months ago, there was a credible lead about remains found in a wooded area near where Carr used to live, and for a few awful days, everyone thought it might finally be closure. DNA testing ruled it out, so we're still here, still waiting, still hoping for an answer that might never come. I think about Jason all the time, wonder what kind of person he'd be now if that night had gone differently, if we'd just stayed together as a group like we were supposed to. That's the thing that haunts me most. How one simple decision, splitting up to cover more ground, to get more candy, cost someone their entire life. My mom stood in the doorway that October evening, arms crossed, giving me that look she always did when she was about to say no to something. I'd been begging for weeks to go trick-or-treating without her following me around like I was still in kindergarten. And honestly, I was starting to lose hope. But then she sighed, did that thing where she rubbed her temples and said fine, I could go with the neighborhood kids as long as I was home by 8:30. I practically jumped through the ceiling. 11 years old and finally getting some freedom felt like winning the lottery. She made me promise about 1,000 things, stuff about staying with the group and not talking to strangers, basic things I already knew. I remember nodding through it all, barely listening, just wanting to grab my costume and get out the door before she changed her mind. The group I went with was 6 kids total from our street in Riverside Heights, this quiet neighborhood in Oregon, where nothing interesting ever happened. There was Tommy Brennan, this 13-year-old who acted like he was too cool for all of us but came anyway, and then me and 4 other kids around my age. We had our route planned out for weeks, targeting all the houses that gave out full-size candy bars first, then hitting the streets with the best decorations. I dressed up as a zombie cheerleader, spent forever getting the fake blood just right on my face and uniform. My plastic pumpkin bucket was orange with this goofy jack-o'-lantern face, same one I'd been using since 1st grade. By 7 that evening, it was already filling up with Snickers and Reese's. All the good stuff. The air had that perfect fall smell, dead leaves and wood smoke, and every single house on our block had their porch lights blazing. I felt like I could do anything, like I was finally old enough to be part of the real world, instead of just watching it from behind my parents. Things started changing around 7:45. We were on Ashwood Drive, this street about 4 blocks from my house, when Sophie's dad pulled up in his pickup truck. She waved goodbye and climbed in, and I remember feeling a little pang of jealousy because her bucket was overflowing and mine was only half full. Then 20 minutes later, Tommy's older brother came to get him, and the Martinez twins said their mom wanted them home early. That left just me and Kevin Walsh, this kid from my math class who dressed up as a vampire with these ridiculous plastic fangs that kept falling out of his mouth. We kept going, hitting a few more houses, but I could tell Kevin was getting tired. His dad showed up around 8:15 in front of this house with a giant inflatable ghost in the yard. Kevin looked at me all apologetic and said he had to go, that his dad had work early in the morning. I told him it was fine, that I'd head home in a few minutes anyway. But I lied. My bucket was still only half full, and I'd promised myself I'd fill it to the top before going back. I kept walking alone down Ashwood, then turned onto Berkeley Road, checking my phone every few minutes. 8:20, 8:25. I had maybe 5 minutes before I needed to start heading back, but there were still houses with their lights on, still candy to collect. That's when I noticed the house at the end of Berkeley, number 847, sitting back from the street with this long driveway and overgrown hedges. I'd walked past it a million times going to the corner store or riding my bike to school. It was one of those houses that always looked the same. Paint peeling on the shutters, grass a little too long, nothing special about it. But that night, something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was because every other house on the block was lit up like a carnival, and this one sat there in complete darkness. The porch light was off, the windows were black, and taped to the front door, I could just barely make out a white piece of paper that said, "No candy," in thick black marker. I should have kept walking. That's what I tell myself now, that I should have just turned around and headed home with my half-full bucket and called it a night. But I was 11 and stubborn, and annoyed that I'd wasted time going out alone when I could have gotten way more candy if the group had stayed together. So I walked up the driveway, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, telling myself I'd just knock once to be polite, to cover every house on my route like I'd planned. The no candy sign was right there at eye level when I reached the door, the tape yellowed and curling at the edges like it had been there for weeks. I raised my hand to knock anyway, one of those stupid defiant moments where you do something just because someone told you not to. But before my knuckles even touched the wood, I heard this sound from inside. A creaking sound, like old furniture shifting weight. Then the door moved, just an inch, swinging inward on its hinges without anyone pulling it. The smell hit me first, not like rotting food or garbage, but something stale and thick, like a room that hadn't had fresh air in months. I stood there in the doorway, my pumpkin bucket hanging from my wrist, peering into the darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the gloom. A narrow hallway, a staircase going up on the left, and straight ahead, through an archway, I could see into what must have been the living room. That's where I saw her. A woman sitting on a couch, completely still, her body angled toward a television that was on but showing nothing except gray and white static. The glow from the screen lit up her face in this weird flickering way, and even from where I stood I could see she was older, maybe 60 or 70, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a floral housecoat, the kind my grandmother used to wear, and her hands rested on her lap like she'd just sat down to watch her shows and fallen asleep. I called out, "Hello?" My voice came out smaller than I meant it to, almost a whisper. The woman didn't move. The static from the TV was the only sound, that constant hissing white noise that makes your ears feel full. I thought maybe she was hard of hearing, that she hadn't noticed the door opening or me standing there. My mom had always taught me to be respectful to elderly people, to help them if they needed it, so I took a step inside. Just one step. The floorboards creaked under my weight, loud enough that I was sure she'd hear it and turn around, but she didn't. She just kept sitting there, facing that static screen, her silhouette perfectly still against the gray light. I took another step, then another, moving down the hallway toward the living room. My bucket bumped against my leg with each step, the candy inside shifting and rustling. When I reached the archway, I could see her more clearly now, see the way her housecoat had a coffee stain on the collar, see the veins visible on the backs of her hands. That's when I noticed her eyes. They were open, wide open actually, staring straight at the television screen with this blank, glassy look that made my chest tighten. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't even blinking. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds, watching her, waiting for her to blink or shift or do anything that would prove she was just zoned out watching TV. But nothing happened. Her chest wasn't moving up and down the way it should when someone breathes. Her fingers weren't twitching. She was just there, frozen, like a mannequin someone had posed on the couch. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask if she was okay, but the words got stuck in my throat. And that's when I saw the coat. A man's jacket, dark blue or maybe black in the dim light, hanging on the wooden chair beside the couch. It was dripping. Not a lot, but enough that I could see the small puddle forming on the hardwood floor beneath it, the fabric heavy and saturated like someone had just come in from a storm. But it hadn't rained that night. I remembered that clearly because I'd checked the weather obsessively all week, terrified that it would pour and ruin everything. The sky had been clear when I left my house, cold but dry, not a cloud anywhere. So why was that coat soaking wet? I stared at it, at the water dripping in this steady rhythm, plip, plip, plip onto the floor, and my brain started putting together things I didn't want it to put together. Someone else was in this house. Someone who'd just come in. Someone who'd hung up their wet coat and then what? Just left this woman sitting here like this? I took a step backward, my sneakers squeaking on the floor, and that tiny sound felt like a gunshot in the silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, louder than the static from the TV. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there right now and call someone, call my mom, call the police, call anyone. I turned toward the hallway, ready to run, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs, right above my head. The ceiling creaked with each step, old wood groaning under weight, and I could track the movement as whoever it was walked across the second floor. They were heading toward the staircase. Toward me, every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stand there clutching my stupid plastic pumpkin bucket and listening to those footsteps get closer. They reached the top of the stairs. I heard the first step creak as someone began descending, then the second step, the third. I could see the edge of the staircase from where I stood, could see the shadow stretching down the wall, growing longer with each step. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run out the front door that was still open behind me, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like being in one of those nightmares where you try to run but your body won't listen. Then something broke through the paralysis. Survival instinct maybe, or just pure terror finally kicking my body into gear. I spun around and bolted for the door, my feet slipping on the hardwood floor before I found traction. The pumpkin bucket flew out of my hand, candy scattering everywhere, Snickers and Reese's bouncing across the floor like marbles. I didn't care. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, throwing myself through the open doorway and down the porch steps. I didn't look back. I just ran down that driveway, my zombie cheerleader costume ripping on a bush as I stumbled past it, fake blood smearing across my face as I wiped away tears I didn't even realize I was crying. When I hit the sidewalk, I kept running, past 3 houses, 4 houses, 5, until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Only then did I stop and turn around. The house sat there in the darkness, exactly like before. Door still open. No one following me. Just that black rectangle of an entrance and silence. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and called my mom. She answered on the first ring, already annoyed that I was cutting it close to 8:30. But when she heard my voice, all choked up and scared, her tone changed instantly. I couldn't get the words out right at first, kept stumbling over them, trying to explain about the house and the woman and the wet coat and the footsteps. She told me to stay where I was, that she was coming to get me right now, and I stood there under a streetlight shaking like a leaf until I saw our car coming down the street. When I got in, she took one look at my face and knew something was really wrong. I told her everything while she drove straight to the police station, didn't even go home first. The officer at the desk looked skeptical at first, probably thought I was some kid making up stories after watching too many scary movies on Halloween, but my mom was insistent. She demanded they check on the woman, said her daughter wouldn't make something like this up. 2 patrol cars went to the house that night. My mom and I waited at the station for what felt like forever, sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs while I kept replaying everything in my head. When the officers came back, their faces were serious in a way that made my stomach hurt. The woman's name was Gloria Hendricks. She was 73 years old and lived alone after her husband passed away 5 years earlier. According to the officers, she died sometime that afternoon, probably a heart attack or stroke, just sitting there on her couch watching television. The medical examiner would confirm it later, but they were pretty sure she'd been gone for hours before I walked in. What scared me even more was what they found upstairs. Her nephew, Douglas Hendricks, had been staying with her for the past 2 weeks. The officers found him in the upstairs bathroom, passed out drunk in the bathtub, still wearing his work clothes that were soaked through, because he'd apparently tried to take a shower with all his clothes on and given up halfway through. That explained the wet coat downstairs and the footsteps I'd heard. The officers told us that Douglas had no idea his aunt had died. He'd come home from work around 6 that evening, already drunk, went straight upstairs without checking on her, and passed out in the tub. He never even noticed she was sitting there dead in the living room. When they woke him up and told him what happened, he completely broke down. They didn't charge him with anything because technically he hadn't done anything wrong, just failed to check on his elderly aunt when he came home too wasted to function. But the officers said if I hadn't gone into that house, if I hadn't called it in, Gloria might have sat there for days before anyone found her. Douglas was supposed to be taking care of her, but he was too deep in his own problems to notice hers. One of the officers, this woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun kind of like Gloria's, she knelt down in front of me and said, I did the right thing by calling for help, that I was very brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt sick and scared and guilty for some reason I couldn't explain. My mom drove us home in silence. When we pulled into our driveway, she turned off the car, but neither of us moved for a long time. Finally, she reached over and squeezed my hand and said that sometimes life puts us in situations we're not prepared for. Situations where we see things we're too young to understand. She said what I saw wasn't my fault, that I'd helped someone even though I didn't realize it at the time. But here's the thing that still messes me up when I think about it. If I'd gotten there 30 minutes earlier, if my friends hadn't left when they did, if I'd filled my bucket faster and gone home on time like I was supposed to, maybe I could have gotten help before Gloria died. Maybe she was still alive when I walked past that house earlier in the evening. Maybe she was sitting there having a heart attack, while I was 3 houses down collecting candy and laughing with my friends. I know that's not rational, that there was nothing I could have done, but that thought sits in my brain like a stone I can't shake loose. I never went trick-or-treating again after that night. Every year my parents would ask if I wanted to go, if I wanted to dress up and walk the neighborhood with friends, and every year I'd make up some excuse about being too old for it or having too much homework. The truth is, I couldn't walk down Berkeley Road anymore without seeing that open door, that flickering gray light from the television, Gloria sitting there with her eyes open and empty. The house got sold about 6 months later to a young couple with a baby. They painted it yellow and put in new windows and planted flowers in the front yard. It looks completely different now, cheerful and alive, but I still cross to the other side of the street when I have to walk past it. Some things change you in ways you can't undo. That night changed me. It taught me that terrible things can happen in the most ordinary places, that death doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It just sits quietly on a couch waiting to be found. And it taught me that sometimes doing the right thing, calling for help, trying to wake someone up, doesn't change anything except the fact that you were there to witness it. I'm 24 now, and I still think about Gloria Hendricks sitting in that dark house. Still wonder if she knew what was happening to her in those final moments. Still hope that wherever she is, someone finally answered her door. Halloween fell on a Saturday in 2022, and I remember thinking that made it perfect. No school the next day meant nobody had an excuse to bail early. I was a junior at Westfield High, and honestly, most people my age had already aged out of trick-or-treating. But my friends and I had this tradition where we'd dress up ironically, hit the rich neighborhoods, and see who could collect the most candy. Childish? Maybe. But free candy is free candy, and it beats sitting at home watching horror movies we'd all seen a dozen times. That year I went as a zombie office worker, complete with a tie and briefcase splattered with fake blood. My buddies Jake and Austin were with me for the first couple hours, but around 9:30 they started getting texts from people at a party across town. They wanted to head out, said we'd already hit most of the good houses anyway. I told them to go ahead. There were still a few streets I wanted to check out, ones we hadn't covered yet, and I figured I had until 11 before my parents would start blowing up my phone. The neighborhood I grew up in, Meadowbrook, sits on the north side of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where people leave their Christmas lights up until February and nobody bats an eye. The houses are a mix of colonials and split levels from the 70s, most with big front yards, and those old maple trees that turn the streets into tunnels of orange and red every October. Halloween always brought the neighborhood to life in this specific way. You'd see families you hadn't spotted in months, kids running in packs from house to house, parents trailing behind with flashlights and thermoses of coffee spiked with something stronger. But by the time Jake and Austin took off, things had started to wind down. Porch lights were clicking off one by one, and the groups of little kids in their store-bought costumes had mostly disappeared. I didn't mind, though. The quiet felt kind of nice after all the screaming and chaos earlier. I walked down Chestnut Lane with my pillowcase of candy slung over my shoulder, still hitting the houses that had their lights on, getting the usual comments from adults about how I was getting too old for this, but here's some Snickers anyway. That's when I first noticed him. I was coming down the steps of the Castellano house, unwrapping a Reese's cup, when I glanced across the street and saw a guy standing under a streetlight. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his hands in the pockets of this dark jacket. No costume, No candy bag, no kids with him. At first I figured he was waiting for someone, maybe a parent whose kid was taking forever at a house or something. But there was nobody else around. The street had emptied out while I was at the door, and it was just me and this guy on opposite sides of the road. He was maybe 40 feet away, far enough that I couldn't make out his face clearly, but close enough that I could tell he was looking in my direction. Not staring exactly, but aware. I felt this little ping in my chest, that weird instinct that tells you someone's paying attention to you. I finished the Reese's, crumpled the wrapper, and kept walking toward the next house with a light on. When I got to the porch and glanced back, the guy had moved. He was further down the street now, still on the opposite side, still just standing there. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. An older woman answered, dropped some fun-size Milky Ways in my bag, and I thanked her and headed back down to the sidewalk. The man was still there. He'd moved again, repositioned himself so he was directly across from where I was now. That's when my brain started doing that thing where it tries to rationalize something that doesn't make sense. Maybe he lived on this street and was just out enjoying the holiday. Maybe he was checking on decorations or waiting for someone who was running late. Maybe I was being paranoid because it was Halloween and I'd watched too many slasher films. But then I walked to the next house, 3 doors down, and when I came back out, he'd moved again. Same distance, same side of the street, just keeping pace with me. He wasn't following exactly, wasn't walking behind me or anything obvious like that. He was mirroring me. Every time I moved, he adjusted his position to stay across from where I was. My heart started beating faster, that deep thud you feel in your ears when adrenaline kicks in. I told myself I was overreacting, that there was a perfectly normal explanation, but my hands were gripping the pillowcase tighter, and I was suddenly very aware of how empty the street had become. I decided to test it. Instead of going to the next house in line, I crossed to the other side of the street, heading toward a place with inflatable decorations still lit up in the yard. If this guy was just randomly walking around, he'd stay where he was or move in some other direction. But if he was actually tracking me, he'd have to adjust. I kept my eyes down, pretending to check my phone, but I was watching him in my peripheral vision. Sure enough, as soon as I crossed, he started moving too. Not rushing, not making it obvious. Just a casual stroll that happened to bring him back across the street to the side I'd just left. We'd basically swapped positions. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was deliberate. I went up to the house, rang the bell, and when a guy in a witch hat answered, I barely registered what candy he gave me. My focus was on the man across the street, who had stopped near a parked minivan and was standing there like he had all the time in the world. When I came back down the steps, I made a split-second decision to head toward the main road where there'd be more lights, maybe more people. I walked faster now, not quite running, but definitely moving with purpose. My sneakers made this rhythmic slap against the pavement, and I kept my breathing steady, trying not to let panic take over. The main road was only 2 blocks away, and there was a gas station on the corner that'd definitely still be open. I could go there, hang out inside for a bit, maybe call my parents to come get me even though I'd feel like an idiot explaining why. As I turned the corner onto Willow Court, I risked a glance back. The man was still there, but he'd stopped moving. He was just standing at the intersection, a dark shape under the streetlight watching me go. Relief flooded through me for about 3 seconds. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the shuffling, distant kind, but close. Deliberate. Someone walking at a steady pace behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to just keep walking, to not confirm what I already knew. But I couldn't help it. I looked back, and there he was. He'd crossed the street and was now following me directly, maybe 20 feet back. The casual pretense was gone. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. My legs moved automatically, faster now, my pillowcase of candy bouncing against my hip. I thought about running, just full-on sprinting toward the main road, but some part of my brain worried that might trigger him to run too. As long as I was walking, he was walking. Maybe if I stayed calm, acted like I hadn't noticed, I could get somewhere safe before things escalated. The houses around me were mostly dark now, their porch lights off, Halloween officially over for their occupants. I thought about banging on someone's door, screaming for help. But what if nobody answered? What if it took too long and he caught up while I was standing there like an idiot? The gas station felt like the better option, somewhere public with cameras and people and bright fluorescent lights. I could see the glow of it in the distance, maybe 3 more minutes if I kept this pace. Behind me, the footsteps maintained their rhythm. Not faster, not slower, just there, constant. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, thinking I'd call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen lit up showing 10:17. Still had 43 minutes until curfew. My parents wouldn't even be worried yet. I was about to dial Jake when I made the mistake of looking back again. The man had closed the distance. He was maybe 10 feet behind me now, close enough that I could see his face in the glow of a porch light I was passing. He looked completely ordinary. That's what freaked me out the most. No mask, no weapon visible, nothing that screamed danger except for the fact that he was following a teenager down a dark street. He had short brown hair, a weathered face that could have been anywhere from 35 to 50, and he was wearing jeans and that dark jacket, navy blue or black. His expression was blank, neutral, like he was just out for an evening walk and I happened to be in front of him. But his eyes were locked on me with this focused intensity that made my skin feel too tight. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and made a choice. I was going home. The gas station was too far, and I wasn't sure I could maintain this pace for 3 more blocks without breaking into a run. My house was closer, just 2 streets over. My parents might not be home yet. They usually didn't get back from their Saturday night dinners until 11. But at least I'd have walls and locks and I could call 911 if this guy tried to follow me inside. I turned right onto Grandview Drive, my street, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. The footsteps behind me turned too. Of course they did. My house was the 7th one down, a tan split level with white shutters and a dogwood tree in the front yard that my dad was always threatening to cut down because it dropped too many leaves. As I got closer, my heart sank. Our porch light was on, the only one still lit on the entire block, which meant I'd forgotten to turn it off before I left. It also meant the house looked occupied when it wasn't. Every other house sat dark and buttoned up for the night, but mine glowed like a beacon. I glanced at the driveway as I approached. Empty. No Honda Accord, no Jeep Cherokee. My parents were definitely still out. The reality of being completely alone hit me like cold water. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, that stupid Batman keychain Jake had given me last Christmas jangling as I pulled them out. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I could hear the footsteps still behind me, and I didn't need to look to know he was still there, still following. I made it to the front walk and practically ran up the 3 concrete steps to the porch. The key slid into the deadbolt on my second try, and I twisted it, hearing that beautiful click of the lock disengaging. I pushed the door open and stumbled inside, immediately turning to slam it shut behind me. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time in full light. He'd stopped at the corner of my property, right where the sidewalk met our front lawn, standing perfectly still under the streetlight. He was just watching, not approaching, not leaving, just standing there with his hands in his pockets like he had all the patience in the world. The porch light illuminated half his face, throwing the other half into shadow, and I could see that same blank expression, that focused stare aimed directly at my front door. I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, then the chain, then the handle lock. 3 locks total. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps, and moved to the window beside it. The curtain was already drawn, but I pulled back just the edge, just enough to peek out. He was still there, standing, waiting. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out jumbled and panicked. A man followed me home. He's outside right now. I'm alone. Please send someone. She was calm, professional, asked for my address and told me officers were on the way. She stayed on the line with me, asking questions I barely heard. Was he armed? I don't know. Did he threaten you? Not verbally, but he followed me for blocks. What's he doing now? Just standing there. The whole time I was on the phone, I kept my eyes on that window, watching his shadow under the streetlight. He didn't move, didn't pace, didn't pull out a phone, didn't do anything. Just stood there like a statue, facing my house. 5 minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. The dispatcher kept talking to me, keeping me calm, and then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Distant at first, then growing louder as they approached. The man heard them too. I saw his head tilt slightly, listening, and then without any rush or panic, he simply turned and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, just a casual walk back the way he'd come, disappearing into the darkness between streetlights. 2 police cars pulled up less than a minute later, their lights painting my house in alternating red and blue. I unlocked the door and met the officers on the porch, and one of them immediately went to search the area while the other took my statement. I told him everything, described the man as best I could, explained the route we'd taken. They found nothing. No sign of him anywhere in the neighborhood. The officer was kind, took me seriously, didn't make me feel stupid or paranoid. He said they'd increase patrols in the area and asked if I wanted to file a formal report. I said yes. My parents came home about 20 minutes later, called back early by the dispatcher, and I'd never been so relieved to see them. They were scared, angry, hovering. My mom kept hugging me while my dad talked to the officers. The police stayed until almost midnight, checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. They never found the man. No neighbors had seen anything, no security cameras caught him, nothing. It was like he'd just vanished. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of him standing there under that streetlight, just watching. Police never identified him, never got any leads. I finished high school, went to college, moved on with my life. But even now, years later, I still check behind me when I'm walking alone at night, and I never, ever trick or treat anymore. Me and my buddies had been planning the ultimate trick-or-treating vlog for weeks. We weren't little kids anymore, just grabbing candy and going home. No, we wanted to document everything, make it cinematic, blow up on TikTok with something actually cool. I'd gotten my driver's license in early September, 2 weeks after turning 16, which suddenly made me the guy with the car and the guy responsible for coordinating this whole operation. Aaron, Chris, Miguel, and me decided we were going full commitment on costumes too. I spent 3 hours working on this zombie surgeon look, complete with a chest wound I made using liquid latex and food coloring that looked disturbingly real. Aaron ordered this insane leather plague doctor mask online that made him look like he stepped out of a horror movie. Chris and Miguel went as killer clowns, except they made it genuinely unsettling instead of the usual party store garbage. The main thing, though, was the GoPros. We each strapped one to our chests, the same kind streamers use, because Aaron was convinced that if we captured everything from multiple angles and edited it right, we could actually go viral. The plan was simple: hit every street in Cedar Brook Estates before midnight, get reactions from homeowners, showcase the craziest decorations, and turn it into this epic Halloween special that would get us internet famous. October 31st, 2023 started out perfect. The weather was weird for Michigan, sitting at like 60 degrees even after the sun went down, so we didn't need jackets covering up our costumes. We started around 7 in the evening, right in that sweet spot where it was dark enough to feel like real Halloween, but early enough that families with little kids were still out. Our neighborhood goes absolutely insane for the holiday. People drop thousands on decorations, turning entire front yards into elaborate haunted graveyards with fog machines, animatronic witches, motion sensor zombies, the whole production. We hit the first 10 houses without anything particularly interesting happening. Just the standard compliments on our costumes and king-size candy bars getting tossed into our bags. Aaron kept up this running commentary for his camera, cracking jokes about which houses had the best setups, doing voiceovers like he was hosting some professional documentary. Around House 15, we got to this place on Buttonwood Drive that had the most elaborate decorations I'd seen all night. Full-size skeletons were climbing up the brick exterior. Orange spotlights illuminated every corner of the yard. and there was this massive plastic cauldron by the front door with dry ice creating this rolling fog effect. The guy who answered looked maybe mid-40s, regular suburban dad type, holding a big wooden bowl filled with premium chocolate bars. He got really enthusiastic about our costumes, especially the GoPros, saying he loved that teenagers still went all out for trick-or-treating instead of thinking they were too cool for it. We thanked him, grabbed our candy, and moved on to the next house without giving that interaction a second thought. Nothing about it seemed off. He was just another friendly neighbor participating in the holiday. We spent the next 4 hours hitting nearly every house in the neighborhood, our bags getting heavier with each stop. The footage we were capturing was actually turning out incredible. We got this one house where the owner had rigged up a fake electric chair that sparked when you walked past it. Another place where someone dressed as Michael Myers just stood completely still in the doorway until we turned to leave, then moved slightly to freak us out. Chris nearly dropped his entire bag of candy when that happened. By 11, our feet were killing us, and the streets had mostly cleared out, just a few stragglers heading home. We'd filled up 2 bags each, way more than we needed, but Aaron insisted we had enough content to make something actually good. The drive back to my place took maybe 10 minutes, all of us buzzing with adrenaline and already talking about how many views we'd get. My mom was still awake when we got home, sitting in the living room with her laptop, working on something for her job at the insurance company. She asked how the night went, told us to keep it down because my little sister was asleep, and said we could use the basement to go through the footage as long as we cleaned up after ourselves. The basement became our editing bay for the next 2 hours. We had 4 different camera angles from the same night, all this raw footage that needed to be synced up and cut together. Aaron was the best with editing software, so he took the lead, pulling all the files onto his laptop while the rest of us watched and gave input. We started from the beginning, watching ourselves leave my driveway, walking up to the first few houses. It was actually pretty cool seeing it all come together, these different perspectives of the same moments. Some houses looked way better on camera than they did in person, the lighting and fog machines creating this legit creepy atmosphere. We were maybe an hour into reviewing everything when Aaron pulled up the footage from Buttonwood Drive, that house with the elaborate decorations and the friendly guy. On screen, you could see all 4 of us approaching the door, the orange lights making our costumes look even better than I remembered. The guy opened the door right on cue, complimented our outfits, dropped chocolate bars into our bags, made that comment about loving teenagers who still trick or treat. Standard interaction, nothing weird. But then Aaron noticed something. After we turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street, his GoPro kept recording. The camera had caught the doorbell, one of those Ring doorbell cameras, still lit up on the doorframe. Aaron paused the video and rewound it. We'd all walked away laughing about something, our voices getting quieter as we moved toward the street, and the guy had closed his door. But the GoPro was still picking up audio, faint but there. At first it sounded like nothing, just that ambient noise you get on recordings, maybe wind or the fog machine still running. Aaron turned up the volume on his laptop and we all leaned in closer. That's when we heard it. Sound coming from inside the house, muffled but distinct enough to make us go quiet. It was crying. Not like sad movie crying, but the kind of desperate, choked sobs that sound like someone's trying really hard to stay silent and failing. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds before we heard a man's voice, low and harsh, whisper something that made my chest tighten. Quiet, quiet. The words came through distorted, like he was speaking through a door or from another room, but you could hear the edge in his tone, threatening. Then nothing. The audio went back to normal street sounds, our voices in the distance talking about the next house. Aaron looked at me, then at Chris and Miguel, and nobody said anything for a solid 10 seconds. Chris was the first to break the silence, suggesting maybe it was a TV show or a movie playing inside. That made sense, right? People leave TVs on during trick-or-treating all the time. We replayed it 4 more times, each of us trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. But the more we listened, the worse it sounded. The crying had this raw quality to it, not performed or acted. And that voice, the way he said quiet twice like that, It had this urgency that didn't match a television program. Miguel suggested maybe it was part of their Halloween setup, like a speaker playing creepy sounds to mess with people. Some houses do elaborate stuff like that, but none of us had seen any speakers near the door, and besides, why would those sounds be playing after we'd already left? Aaron scrubbed through more of the footage, checking if any other houses had weird audio, but everything else was completely normal. Just our voices, doorbells ringing, people saying Happy Halloween, the usual neighborhood ambiance. It was only that one house on Buttonwood Drive, only that specific moment right after the guy closed the door. I kept thinking about how normal he'd seemed, how genuinely friendly his whole vibe was. The decorations, the expensive candy, that note he had taped to his mailbox that said, Happy Halloween from the Graysons, with a little ghost drawn on it. Everything about that house screamed regular suburban family, but that audio didn't match any of it. We sat there in my basement, the timestamp on the video frozen at the exact moment you could see the Ring doorbell camera on his door frame, and this sick feeling started building in my stomach that wouldn't go away. By 1 a.m, we'd exhausted every rational explanation we could think of. Chris was still pushing the TV theory, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Aaron suggested we just delete that part of the footage and use everything else for the vlog, pretend we never heard it. Miguel hadn't said much for the past 20 minutes, just sitting there staring at the paused video with this look on his face I couldn't read. I wanted to agree with Aaron, just forget about it and move on, but something kept stopping me. That crying sounded too real. That voice sounded too threatening. What if someone actually needed help and we just ignored it because we didn't want to deal with something complicated? I told them I was going to show my mom. They all looked at me like I was crazy, saying she'd probably just tell us we were being paranoid, that we'd get in trouble for wasting people's time, that it was probably nothing anyway. But I couldn't shake it. I went upstairs and found my mom still in the living room, now watching some crime documentary with her reading glasses on. When I told her we'd found something strange in our footage and asked if she could listen to it, she gave me this tired look like she expected me to show her a funny TikTok or something. She followed me down to the basement anyway, and Aaron played the clip for her without any build-up or explanation. She listened to it once, asked Aaron to play it again, then a third time with the volume even higher. The expression on her face changed completely. She asked which house it was, and when I told her Buttonwood Drive, the one with all the skeleton decorations, she got this focused look I'd only seen a handful of times before. My mom works in insurance claims, deals with investigations and police reports pretty regularly for her job, so she's not the type to overreact or jump to conclusions. But she wasn't dismissing this. She asked Aaron to send her the video file, then told all of us to stay in the basement while she made a phone call upstairs. We could hear her voice through the ceiling, muffled but intense, talking to someone for maybe 15 minutes. When she came back down, she had her phone in her hand and this serious expression that made my heart start pounding. She said she'd called a friend of hers who works for the local police department, explained the situation, and sent him the audio clip. He was taking it seriously enough that he'd already contacted the officers on duty that night. She told us we did the right thing by showing her that we shouldn't post any of this footage online, and that we might need to talk to police in the next day or two. The way she said it made the whole thing feel suddenly real, in a way it hadn't before. Like we'd stumbled into something that was way bigger than just a weird noise on a recording. None of us slept that night. Aaron, Chris, and Miguel crashed at my place because it was already past 2 a.m, and nobody wanted to go home yet. We just sat around refreshing our phones, checking local news sites, waiting for something to happen. Nothing came up. By 6 a.m, when the sun started coming up and my little sister woke up for Saturday morning cartoons, we still hadn't heard anything. My mom made us breakfast and told us to try to act normal, that these things take time. But how were we supposed to act normal? I kept picturing that house, those decorations, that friendly guy who'd complimented our costumes. Kept hearing that crying and that harsh whisper saying quiet, quiet over and over in my head. Around 9, my mom got a phone call. She stepped into the kitchen to take it and we all went silent trying to listen. When she came back into the living room, her face had gone pale. She sat down on the couch and told us that police had gone to the house on Buttonwood Drive early that morning, with a welfare check. What they found there made my entire body go cold in a way I'd never experienced before. The man who'd answered the door for us, the one with the friendly smile and the bowl of chocolate bars, had a woman locked in his basement. She'd been missing from a town 40 minutes away for 3 weeks. The details came out slowly over the next few days, pieced together from news reports and what my mom's police contact was willing to share. The woman's name was Nicole Hartman, 26 years old, a nurse who disappeared on her way home from a night shift in early October. Her family had been searching for her, posting flyers, organizing search parties, doing everything they could to find her. The man, Gregory Grayson, had apparently seen her at a gas station, followed her to a parking lot and taken her at gunpoint. He'd kept her in a reinforced room in his basement for 22 days. The night we showed up at his door, she'd heard voices outside and tried to cry out for help, which is what Aaron's GoPro had picked up. Grayson had rushed down to silence her right after closing the door on us. If we hadn't been wearing those cameras, if Aaron hadn't decided to review the footage, if we'd just assumed it was nothing and moved on, she'd probably still be there. The police told my mom that the room he'd built was soundproofed well enough that neighbors had never heard anything. The only reason we caught it was because his Ring doorbell mic was sensitive enough to pick up the sound during that brief moment when she tried to scream, and our GoPro happened to be recording at the exact right angle to capture the audio feed. The timing was pure chance, this horrible coincidence that ended up saving her life. The weeks after that were surreal. News outlets wanted to interview us, but my mom shut that down immediately, saying we were minors and didn't need that kind of attention. We had to give official statements to detectives, walking them through the entire night, explaining how the GoPros worked, why we were recording everything. They took Aaron's camera as evidence, along with all the footage from that night. The vlog we'd planned never happened. None of us wanted to touch that content anymore, and honestly, the thought of editing together a fun Halloween video felt disgusting after what we'd learned. School was weird too. Word got around fast in our town, and suddenly everyone knew we were the kids who'd accidentally uncovered a kidnapping. Some people treated us like heroes. Others just stared at us in the hallways like we were fascinating specimens. I hated both reactions equally. Aaron stopped talking about TikTok fame and took down most of his social media. Chris and Miguel stayed close, but we didn't really talk about that night unless we had to. The thing nobody tells you about something like this is how it sticks with you in these random, unexpected ways. I couldn't watch horror movies anymore without feeling sick. Couldn't see Ring doorbells without my chest getting tight. Every time someone seemed a little too friendly or a little too normal, I'd wonder what was actually going on behind their front door. About 6 months later, we got word that Nicole Hartman wanted to meet us. My mom set it up through her police contact, made sure it was done properly with counselors present and everything. We met her at a coffee shop in a town over, neutral territory where she wouldn't run into people who knew her. She looked different from her missing person photos, thinner and with shorter hair, but her eyes were what got me. She had this intensity to her that made me understand she'd been through something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. She thanked us, not in a dramatic way, but quietly and genuinely. Said she'd heard our voices that night through the walls, heard us laughing and talking about our costumes, and for a brief moment thought maybe someone would notice something was wrong. When she heard us leaving, she'd made the choice to risk crying out, knowing he might hurt her worse for it, but thinking it might be her only chance. She told us that choice saved her life, but it was our choice to not ignore what we'd heard that actually got her out. We didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone whose nightmare you accidentally stumbled into? She didn't stay long, said she just needed us to know that we'd done something that mattered, that we shouldn't feel guilty or scared about what happened. I think she could tell we'd been carrying this weight around, and she wanted to lift some of it off us. After she left, the four of us just sat there for a while, not really talking, just processing everything. It didn't fix what we'd been feeling, didn't make the whole thing suddenly okay, but it helped. Gregory Grayson got 40 years, and Nicole moved to a different state to start over. We're seniors now, almost done with high school, and we still don't really talk about that Halloween. But sometimes when I see those true crime shows my mom watches, or when October rolls around and people start putting up decorations, I think about how close we came to just dismissing what we heard. How easy it would have been to call it nothing and move on. That's the part that still gets me. It was supposed to be one of those harmless Halloween nights that parents half enjoy for the nostalgia and half endure for the sugar chaos. My two kids, Lily and Ben, were bouncing in the back seat, their costumes already crumpled from the drive. We had heard through one of Lily's classmates that the houses over in Briarwood Circle were giving out the good stuff, the full-sized candy bars, not the tiny ones you get everywhere else. I figured it would be worth the drive, a fun detour before heading home. The neighborhood looked like something out of a magazine. Tall oaks, trimmed lawns, and houses glowing with string lights and pumpkins on every porch. We turned onto the cul-de-sac, and it really did feel like a small carnival. Kids in every direction, parents chatting at the curb, porch lights gleaming one after another. Every house but one. On the far end sat a two-story home, darker than the rest. No lights, no decorations, nothing but a faint blue flicker from inside, like the glow of a television left on. The front door was slightly open, just enough to notice from the street. I remember thinking maybe the owners had stepped out for a minute or just ran out of candy. I told the kids to skip it, but Ben was fixated on that house. He said he saw movement inside, a shadow by the stairs. He was only 7, and full of that fearless curiosity that makes you both proud and terrified as a parent. Lily, who was 9 and already in that know-it-all stage, laughed and said Ben was imagining things. They argued for a bit, and before I could finish telling them to move along, Lily said she'd prove it was nothing. She grabbed her plastic pumpkin bucket and started walking toward the house. I remember how her cape trailed behind her, brushing against the sidewalk, the sound of it oddly loud against all the laughter and chatter around us. I stayed by the car, not wanting to make a scene by yelling, figuring she'd knock, get no answer, and come right back. But she didn't. She stepped onto the porch, hesitated, and looked back at me once. Then she pushed the door a little wider. That's when the faint sound of a TV came clearer. Static and muffled voices, like an old news broadcast playing on loop. The air felt strangely still around that spot, as if the rest of the street had gone quieter. I saw her glance over her shoulder toward the living room inside. Then her small hand disappeared behind the doorframe. A second later, Ben followed her halfway up the path before I caught up and told him to stop. I called Lily's name, but before she could answer, I heard her scream. I ran up the path so fast I nearly tripped over Ben's candy bucket. The door was wide open now, the living room lit only by the glow of a television showing nothing but gray fuzz. The sound filled the air in this hollow way, like it had been playing for hours. I shouted for Lily again and moved deeper into the house, my voice echoing strangely. That was when I saw movement. 2 small figures crouched under a dining table, their faces streaked with tears. Lily and Ben were both shaking, clutching each other. They wouldn't speak at first, just kept pointing toward the kitchen. I told them to stay put and stepped closer to where they were pointing. The smell hit me before I saw anything. Metallic, thick, and wrong. In the kitchen, a man sat tied to a chair, duct tape across his mouth. He was alive, barely, his eyes wide and darting toward me, pleading. I froze for a second that felt much longer than it probably was, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The light from the refrigerator spilled across the tile, showing scuff marks on the floor, and one of the back doors was swinging slightly, as if someone had just gone through it. I ran back to the kids, grabbed them both, and rushed out the front door, yelling for someone to call the police. A couple of parents nearby turned, confused at first, thinking maybe it was just some Halloween prank. When they saw the look on my face, they realized it wasn't. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac that had been buzzing with laughter fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens getting closer. I tried to keep the kids calm, but Lily wouldn't stop repeating. He wasn't alone. Someone else was there. Her voice had this hollow, terrified tone that didn't sound like her at all. The police arrived fast. They told us to stay by the car while they cleared the house. Watching them move inside with their flashlights felt unreal, like I was outside my own life. I remember one of the officers calling out that the back door was open, another saying the ropes were fresh. Whoever did that had left minutes before we showed up. They led the kids into an ambulance to keep them warm, and one officer asked me questions I could barely process. My focus kept drifting back to that house, the one with no lights, sitting quietly at the end of the street as if nothing had ever happened there. Later that night, after giving our statements, an officer walked me to the house once more. The street was empty by then, candy wrappers and glow sticks scattered along the pavement, porch lights flicking off one by one. From the driveway, I could see through the open doorway. The TV had been turned off, and the silence inside felt heavier than before. The officer told me the homeowner's name was Mr. Dillard, a retired teacher who lived alone. He had apparently answered the door to what he thought were trick-or-treaters, and someone forced their way in. The rest, he said quietly, was just bad timing. For weeks afterward, Lily and Ben would wake up crying, saying they heard footsteps in their room or whispers near the window. We changed the locks, added cameras, did everything the police suggested, but the fear stuck to them like dust that never fully clears. One afternoon, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. They'd found fingerprints in the kitchen, but none matched anyone in their database. Whoever it was had planned everything, down to the timing with the trick-or-treat crowds. They had used the laughter and noise outside as cover to move unseen. The house was sold months later. I drove past it once, against my better judgment. The new owners had painted it pale yellow, fixed the porch light, and planted flowers by the walkway. But something about it still looked wrong, not haunted in a ghost story way, just violated, like the walls had seen too much. I parked for a minute, watching that porch where Lily had stood, her little cape fluttering. I imagined what would have happened if we'd arrived just a few minutes earlier, or later. Even now, I avoid cul-de-sacs. Halloween still comes every year, of course, but we keep it small. Our neighborhood, a few houses, nothing fancy. The kids are older and pretend not to remember much, but I know they do. Sometimes when a TV flickers through a window as we drive by, Lily glances away. I do too. Because I can't help but think that somewhere out there, whoever was in that house that night is still walking among all the noise and costumes, just waiting for another dark porch and another open door. It had been one of those autumn nights when the air felt sharp enough to taste. My friends and I had been moving from house to house, laughing through our masks, trading chocolate bars under the streetlights. We had planned this route for weeks, but somewhere between the last block and the park, I lost sight of them. Their voices faded into a mix of distant laughter and rustling leaves. I stood there for a moment, clutching my plastic pumpkin full of candy, trying to decide which way they had gone. Every direction looked the same, rows of houses with glowing porches and carved pumpkins flickering in the dark. I figured they had probably cut across the neighborhood toward the main street, so I decided to take a shortcut through the narrow alley that ran behind the houses. It was quiet there, too quiet maybe, but I told myself it would save time. The fences on both sides were tall, and the smell of damp leaves mixed with the faint scent of garbage. My sneakers brushed against the gravel as I walked, the sound strangely loud in the stillness. My costume, a witch dress my mom had made, kept catching on the candy bag as I shifted it from one hand to the other. Halfway through, I noticed how dark it was. The houses on either side had their lights facing the front yards, leaving the alley hidden in shadows. The only sound was the faint drag of my candy bag against my leg. I thought about using my phone's flashlight, but when I pulled it from my pocket, the screen was black. Dead. I sighed, more annoyed than scared, and kept going, quickening my steps. The air seemed colder the farther I went, like the night was thickening around me. That was when I heard it, a soft crunch behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping on gravel. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank. Nothing. Just a row of fences and the faint shimmer of moonlight on a metal trash bin. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat, but my heart was already thudding a little faster. Then a voice drifted through the quiet, low and steady, almost gentle. "Hey, you dropped something." I took a slow step backward, scanning the fences, expecting movement or a glint of fabric, but the alley stayed still. The only thing moving was a loose strip of paper fluttering against one of the trash bins. My chest felt heavy, and I tried to convince myself someone was just teasing from the yard, maybe an older kid trying to scare people. Still, something about the voice didn't sound playful. It was calm in a way that made no sense. I turned again and walked faster, the gravel crunching louder under my sneakers. That sound came again, soft but perfectly timed with mine. I started jogging, clutching the candy bag so tightly the plastic handle bit into my palm. Every time I sped up, the steps behind me matched exactly, not closer, not farther, just echoing me. My mind was racing through excuses. Maybe it was my own echo bouncing between the fences. Maybe the sound carried weird through the alley. I told myself to breathe, just make it to the end, and the whole thing would look ridiculous in daylight. But the end still looked far, and the dark stretched on like it was never going to open back to the street. A sharp clang made me stop. One of the trash bins had toppled behind me, rolling until it hit a fence. The lid spun, making a hollow ringing sound that died out slow. I didn't remember bumping into it. I didn't even think I was close enough. That was when I caught sight of something. Just a flicker between the slats of a fence. A darker shape moving behind the gaps, like someone was walking along the opposite side, keeping pace with me. I couldn't see a face, only the outline, tall and motionless each time I stopped. My breath felt too loud, echoing against the wooden walls around me. I didn't dare shout. Every instinct told me that making noise would make it worse. Instead, I broke into a full run, the candy spilling from the pumpkin as I held it against me. My legs burned and the end of the alley finally came into view, a faint square of streetlight. Just before I reached it, I heard that voice again, closer this time, clear as if someone was leaning right beside my ear. "You really should not have come this way." I reached the end of the alley and burst out onto a quiet street lined with houses that all looked the same. Every porch light seemed too far away. My chest hurt from running, and I turned to look back. At first, nothing moved. Then a shadow slid into view at the far end, tall and still, just standing there between the fences. I couldn't make out details, just the outline, head slightly tilted, hands hanging at its sides. For a second, it felt like the world had gone silent, the way it does before a storm. Then, a small crunch of gravel came again, like it had taken a single step forward. I ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door, yelling for help. The sound of my fist on the wood echoed through the street, but no one came. Porch lights flickered on across the road, yet this door stayed dark. I shouted again, my voice cracking. That was when a light finally came on inside, and I saw the curtain move. An older woman opened the door halfway, eyes wide, like she was scared before she even heard me speak. I begged her to let me in, explaining that someone was following me, that I didn't know where my friends had gone. She hesitated just a second, then opened the door enough for me to squeeze through. I turned one last time before stepping inside, and the shadow was still there at the end of the alley, not moving, not walking away, just watching. The woman slammed the door and locked it 3 times. She told me her name was Eleanor and that she had already called the police before even opening the door because she had heard footsteps outside her fence for the last 10 minutes. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there on her hallway rug, trying to steady my breathing while she made tea like this sort of thing happened all the time. When the police arrived, they searched the alley and the backyards nearby. They didn't find anyone. One of the officers said it was probably a teenager in a costume playing a prank, but Eleanor shook her head and said the footsteps had started before any trick-or-treaters passed by. The officer smiled politely, told us to lock the doors, and left. I never told my parents the full story, just that I got lost and a kind woman helped me. But I still remember that figure, motionless under the streetlight. It never chased me. It didn't have to. After that night, I stopped using shortcuts. Even months later, I found myself crossing streets just to avoid narrow spaces between buildings. My friends teased me for being jumpy, but I could not explain the kind of silence that had filled that alley. It was not like hearing something strange. It was more like the world had paused around me. I tried convincing myself it was some older kid in a mask, yet part of me never believed it. The way that shadow had stood, perfectly still, like it did not need to move to be dangerous, that stayed with me. Eleanor kept in touch for a while after the incident. She told my mom she would walk with me to school if I ever felt uneasy. A few weeks later, I heard from her again. She called to say someone had tried her back gate late one night. When the police came, they found only a small pile of candy wrappers and a single black glove near her fence. They told her it was probably nothing. She said she kept her windows closed after that. I did too. Years passed and I thought about that night less and less. But one Halloween, while handing out candy at my parents' place, I noticed something strange. A man lingered across the street, too far to see clearly. He never came closer, just stood under the same kind of streetlight that had lit that alley years ago. Kids walked past him laughing, and he never moved. When I blinked, he was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but I stayed inside after that. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I catch the sound of gravel shifting outside, my mind goes straight back to that night. I keep telling myself it's just the wind or a raccoon, but deep down, I know that voice was real. I never saw his face, but I remember every word, soft and steady, like he was right behind me again. You really should not have come this way. When I think about that night, I can still smell the mix of damp leaves and pumpkin candles. I lived on a quiet street where every kid knew every porch light that meant candy. We were a small group, me, Jason, and 2 others from the same block, and we had been planning our route for weeks. I remember my mom fussing over my costume, making sure the fake blood on my sleeve didn't stain the carpet. It felt like the kind of Halloween you wait all year for. Cool air, glowing decorations, parents chatting by mailboxes. We were too old to be walking with adults, too young to realize how fragile that kind of safety really is. Jason was the one who always took the lead, carrying a flashlight even when there were street lamps. He had this loud laugh that echoed down the sidewalk, the kind that made other kids turn around. That night he was dressed as a pirate, with an eye patch that kept slipping and a plastic sword that wouldn't stay in its belt loop. We joked that he'd trip over it before we got home. He didn't like being told to slow down, though. Said the faster we went, the more candy we'd get before the other kids hit the good houses. We had been walking for maybe an hour when we decided to split up. 2 of us turned toward Maple Hollow, and Jason said he wanted to check out the houses past the fire station. He waved like he'd see us in 10 minutes, his bag already bulging with candy. None of us argued. It was normal to separate for a bit and meet back at the park. I remember the crunch of leaves underfoot, the way the fog started to drift in from the open fields, swallowing the glow from the streetlights. It felt like the town was folding in on itself. The next time anyone saw Jason, he was talking to a man standing beside a red truck near the corner of Birch Lane. That's what one of the younger kids said later. The man was dressed like a firefighter, with reflective stripes catching the light. Jason had leaned against the truck, eating from his candy bag like he was just chatting. Nobody thought anything of it at the time. Why would they? The guy looked official, the truck looked real, and Halloween makes everything seem a little make-believe anyway. We regrouped at the park around 9. The swings creaked in the wind, candy wrappers stuck to the damp grass, and Jason's flashlight wasn't among the ones flickering in the dark. At first we joked that he'd probably gone home early to trade candy with his sister. But when I passed his house on my way back, the porch light was still on, and his mom was standing out front, calling his name down the street. She looked worried in that quiet way parents do when they're still pretending everything's fine. I remember how her voice carried through the cold air, echoing off the houses. The police came fast that night. Flashlights swept through yards, car doors slammed, and they started asking questions none of us knew how to answer. They showed us a photo later, grainy, pulled from someone's security camera. It showed the red truck parked under a flickering streetlight, Jason standing nearby, and the man beside him wearing a real turnout coat. The patch on his sleeve was visible even in the blurry frame. That detail changed everything. It wasn't just a costume. The man turned out to be a firefighter who had been suspended months earlier. He lived 2 towns away, in a rundown duplex near the river. The police searched his place, but he was gone. They found uniforms, maps, and a collection of Halloween masks in a box by his bed. It didn't make sense. Why would someone like that come here, to our small neighborhood on that night? For weeks afterward, people left porch lights off and kept their kids inside after sunset. The decorations came down early and nobody said Jason's name out loud anymore. A week later, a runner found Jason's backpack in a ditch along the highway. It was soaked from the rain but still zipped shut, candy inside untouched. The wrappers were dry, like someone had packed them carefully before dropping the bag there. The sight of that bag in the news photo did something to me. It made everything real in a way I had been avoiding. I stopped walking past the fire station on my way to school. The sound of sirens started making my chest tighten. It's strange how one ordinary night can take every safe place and make it feel different forever. Months went by, and the town started pretending life was normal again. Streetlights got fixed, the fire station repainted its doors, and new families moved in like nothing had ever happened. But for those of us who were there, it never really left. I still remember the police car that parked on our street every evening for weeks, engine idling, officers waiting for any sign that the man might return. Nobody ever saw him again, but I think most of us kept expecting to. It felt like unfinished business, like the story had paused, not ended. One night, about a year later, I was cleaning out the attic with my dad when I found one of Jason's old baseball caps. He used to leave stuff at our place all the time. The cap had a faint smell of smoke even after all that time. My dad said it was probably from storage, but the scent reminded me of something else, the way the air had smelled that Halloween night near the fire station. Heavy, chemical, like something had been burned that shouldn't have been. I did not say anything to him, but I kept that cap hidden in my room for years. Every October, the local paper runs a short piece about missing children, and Jason's name still shows up. His mom moved away after the 2nd anniversary. Some say she visits the site where the backpack was found every Halloween, leaving a small pumpkin with a candle inside. A few of us from the old neighborhood meet at the park sometimes, the same one where we waited for him that night. We don't talk much when we're there. There's nothing new to say. Even now, when I see a fire truck driving by with its lights flashing, I feel that same cold awareness, like the world can change without warning. One man, one wrong trust, and a kid who just wanted more candy. It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but for everyone who lived on that street, Halloween stopped being a holiday that year. It became the night Jason never made it home. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Widowhood changes you in ways you never expect, and one of those changes was my decision to stay on the property Glenn and I had built together in rural Montana. He passed 2 winters before that night, and somewhere between burying him and turning 43, I convinced myself that staying made sense. Our nearest neighbors, the Farley family, lived about 3 miles down the county road, and the closest sheriff's substation was in Ridgefield, a good 50-minute drive on roads that turned treacherous after dark. People in the city think isolation sounds peaceful, romantic even. But there is nothing romantic about being a woman alone in a house surrounded by wheat fields and darkness that stretches in every direction. That particular night in early November 2017, I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted from splitting firewood and fixing a section of fence the wind had knocked down. My 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a mutt named Copper, slept in their usual spots by the wood stove. The wind had died down and the house had settled into that deep, consuming quiet that only exists miles away from civilization. I woke to Duke's growl, low and guttural, the kind of sound he only made when something was genuinely wrong. My eyes opened to complete darkness, and for a moment I lay still, listening, trying to separate real sounds from the remnants of whatever dream I had been having. Then Copper joined in, both dogs now at the bedroom window, their bodies rigid, hackles raised in silhouettes against the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I heard it then, distant but unmistakable, other dogs barking somewhere out in the night. The Farleys had hounds, and they never barked like that unless something had them spooked. I pushed myself up on one elbow, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand, when I saw it, a sweep of headlights moving slowly across my eastern field. Not on the road, but actually in the field, cutting through the harvested wheat stubble. My heart began pounding as I watched the lights move with purpose, methodical, like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Nobody had any business being on my property at. I checked the clock, 2:47 in the morning. I did not turn on the lamp. Some instinct, ancient and primal, told me to stay in the dark. Instead, I slid out of bed and crouched below the window, peering over the sill just enough to watch. The headlights had stopped moving now, parked at the edge of my property near the old grain silo. Glenn had never gotten around to tearing down. Then they went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the dogs growling and the distant sound of the Farley hounds still going wild. Then I saw a second set of headlights appear, coming from the opposite direction, from the west where the old logging road cut through the tree line. These lights also moved slowly, deliberately, and they also stopped at the perimeter of my property before going dark. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers finding it in the darkness, and I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and I immediately dimmed it, shielding the glow with my body. No signal. There was never good signal out here, but sometimes I could get one bar near the kitchen window. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, Duke and Copper following close behind me, their nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When I reached the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall beside the window that faced the front yard and the long gravel driveway that connected my property to the county road. What I saw made my legs go weak. A third vehicle was parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights also off, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. They had surrounded the house. 3 vehicles, positioned at 3 different points, and all of them had known exactly where to stop, exactly how to approach without being seen from the road. I checked my phone again, holding it up near the window, watching desperately for even one bar to appear. Nothing. I thought about the landline in the living room, the old rotary phone Glenn had insisted on keeping because cell service was so unreliable. I started moving toward it, staying low, when I heard something that stopped me cold, the distinct sound of a radio crackling somewhere outside, followed by a man's voice too quiet to make out the words, but close enough to hear the tone. I crawled to the living room, my knees scraping against the rug Glenn's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The rotary phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I lifted the receiver as quietly as I could, pressing it to my ear. Dead silence. No dial tone, nothing. They had cut the line. These were not drunk teenagers or lost hunters. These were people who had planned this, who knew that cutting the phone line would leave me stranded, who understood that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. I set the receiver down and pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. Glenn's shotgun was in the bedroom closet, a 12-gauge Remington he had taught me to use for coyotes that sometimes went after the chickens. I had not fired it since he died, but I knew it was loaded, knew there was a box of shells on the top shelf beside it. I needed to get back to the bedroom without being seen through any of the windows. Duke suddenly let out a sharp bark, and I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, whispering for him to be quiet. Through the living room window, I saw a beam of light sweep across the front porch. A flashlight. Someone was on my porch, right outside the front door, maybe 15 feet from where I was crouched in the darkness. I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, slow and deliberate, and then the light paused at the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold hardwood, holding both dogs by their collars as they trembled and growled. The beam moved across the room above me, illuminating the couch, the bookshelf, the fireplace mantel with our wedding photo still displayed. Then the light clicked off, and I heard the footsteps retreat, followed by that radio crackle again. A different voice this time, deeper, responded with something I could not understand. They were communicating positions, coordinating movements, and they were doing it with the kind of calm efficiency that terrified me more than anything else. I waited until the footsteps faded before I started crawling toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. Every creak of the floorboard sounded impossibly loud, and I kept expecting a window to shatter or a door to burst open at any moment. When I finally reached the bedroom, I eased the closet door open and felt around in the darkness until my fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded by touch alone, and grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. My hands were unsteady as I shoved extra shells into the pockets of my pajama pants. I had no plan beyond this, no idea what I was supposed to do against multiple armed men who clearly knew what they were doing. I thought about hiding, about crawling into the space beneath the bed or locking myself in the bathroom, but I knew that would only delay whatever was coming. These people had not gone through all this trouble just to leave empty-handed. They wanted something, and the only thing of value in this house was me. A sound from the back of the house made Duke lunge forward, barking furiously, and this time I could not stop him. He bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, Copper right behind him, and I heard the back door rattle violently in its frame. Someone was trying to force it open. I ran after the dogs, the shotgun raised, my bare feet slapping against the floor. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the door shaking as someone threw their weight against it from outside. The deadbolt was holding, but the door was old, the wood frame soft from decades of Montana winters. It would not hold for long. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door and screamed at the top of my lungs that I had a gun, that I would shoot anyone who came through. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I heard that radio crackle again, followed by a voice I will never forget as long as I live. It was calm, almost amused, and it said clearly enough for me to hear through the door, "She is in the kitchen, armed, 12 gauge, probably the husband's old Remington." They knew about Glenn. They knew about the gun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost doubled over. These were not strangers who had randomly chosen my house. These were people who had watched me, studied me, learned my routines and my vulnerabilities. I thought about all the times I had gone into town for groceries, all the conversations I had at the feed store or the gas station, mentioning that I lived alone now, that Glenn was gone, that the property was too big for one person, but I could not bring myself to sell. I had told strangers my entire situation without ever thinking twice. The voice outside spoke again, this time directed at me. "Mrs. Hartley, we know you are alone. We know the nearest deputy is 47 minutes away on a good night, and the roads are icy. We know your cell phone does not work out here. We have done this before, and it always goes easier when people cooperate." The casual way he listed these facts, like he was reading from a checklist, made me realize how carefully they had planned everything. They had probably watched the house for weeks, maybe months, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, which lights I turned on and when I turned them off. I backed away from the door, the shotgun still raised, my mind racing through options that all seemed hopeless. The windows were old single-pane glass, easy to break. The doors were solid, but the frames were weak. Even if I shot one of them, there were others, and they would be through the house before I could reload. Then I remembered something, the root cellar. Glenn had dug it himself the second year we lived here, an underground space beneath the kitchen accessible through a trap door hidden under the rug by the pantry. He had installed a heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs, paranoid about tornadoes even though they were rare this far north. The cellar had supplies, canned food, water, a battery-powered radio, and most importantly, it had a lock that could only be opened from the inside. If I could get down there with the dogs, I could wait them out. Eventually, someone would notice I was missing. Eventually, help would come. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan I had, and I was running out of time. I moved quickly, pulling back the rug with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready with the other. The trapdoor was right where it had always been, the iron ring handle cold against my palm. I yanked it open and whistled for the dogs, and Duke understood immediately, bounding down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Copper hesitated, confused, and I had to grab him by the collar and practically shove him through the opening. I was halfway down the stairs myself when I heard glass shatter somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps and voices calling out to each other. They were inside. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, fumbling in the darkness for the steel door at the bottom of the stairs. My fingers found the handle, and I pulled it closed just as I heard footsteps in the kitchen directly above me. The lock was a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would find on a commercial door, and it slid into place with a solid thunk that echoed in the small concrete room. I pressed my back against the cold wall, both dogs huddled against my legs, and I listened to the sounds of my home being torn apart above me, cabinets slamming, furniture being overturned, and then footsteps directly over the trapdoor, followed by the sound of someone pulling at the handle. A voice, the same calm voice from before, called down through the floor. "Mrs. Hartley, that is a very old door. We have tools, we have time. The choice is yours." I did not answer. I sat in the darkness with my shotgun aimed at the steel door. My dogs pressed against me, and I waited. I heard drilling, prying, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I heard voices arguing, urgent now, the calm tone gone. A vehicle engine started somewhere outside, then another. Through the concrete walls, I heard tires on gravel moving fast, moving away. I did not move from that cellar until sunlight began to creep through the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. When I finally climbed out, my house was destroyed. Every drawer emptied, every closet ransacked, furniture overturned and broken. But I was alive. The sheriff found me sitting on my front porch with the shotgun across my lap, and I told him everything. He listened with the expression I could not read, then told me there had been 3 other home invasions in the county over the past 2 years, all isolated properties, all women living alone. 2 of those women were never seen again. They never caught the men who did it. I sold the property 6 weeks later and moved to Bozeman, where I can see my neighbors' houses from my kitchen window. I still do not sleep through the night. I still wake up at 2:47 in the morning, listening for dogs barking in the distance, waiting for headlights to sweep across a field that no longer exists outside my window. Ridgefield, Montana is the kind of place that does not show up on most maps. Population 200 and something, depending on who had moved away or passed on that year. My best friend Haley and I were sent there every summer to stay with my grandparents while our parents worked. And by the time we finished 6th grade, we knew that dirt road to Perkins General Store better than we knew our own backyards. 4 miles of packed earth cutting through wheat fields and abandoned farmland, with nothing but fence posts and the occasional rusted tractor to break up the endless gold horizon. We had walked it dozens of times without incident, 2 12-year-old girls with too much energy and not enough supervision, picking wild blackberries and racing each other to the old Jennings barn that sat rotting at the halfway point. Our grandparents never worried about us making that trip alone, because nothing ever happened in Ridgefield. That was the whole point of the place, the safety of isolation, the comfort of knowing every single face in town. On that Thursday morning in early June, Grandma pressed a $20 bill into my palm and handed me her grocery list, and Haley and I set off like we had 100 times before. The heat hit us the moment we stepped off the porch, that dry Montana summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the road like a mirage. Haley complained about the dust getting into her sandals, and I told her she should have worn sneakers like I did, and we bickered about nothing as we walked. We were roughly 2 miles in when I heard the engine approaching from behind, which meant nothing at first because farmers drove that road constantly. But this vehicle slowed down in a way that made me turn around and look. A dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper and mud splattered across the wheel wells pulled up alongside us, keeping pace with our walking speed. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window, and I got my first clear look at his face. He had thin blonde hair slicked back against his scalp with something greasy, pale blue eyes that seemed too wide for his face, and a smile that stretched his lips in a way that showed every single one of his yellowed teeth. When he spoke, his voice came out warm and friendly, the kind of voice adults use when they want children to trust them immediately. "You girls must be the Whitaker grandkids," he said, nodding like he already knew the answer. "Heading to Perkins, I bet. Your grandma send you for groceries?" I remember feeling a small wave of relief at that moment, because he knew our family name, which meant he had to be a local, someone safe. Haley relaxed a little beside me too, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The man kept talking, explaining that he worked on one of the farms further out past the county line and came through Ridgefield every few weeks for supplies. He said his name was Gene, or maybe it was Dean, something short and plain that I cannot remember clearly anymore because everything that came after erased those small details from my mind. What I do remember is what he said next, leaning further toward the open window with that strange wide smile still plastered across his face. He told us there had been coyote attacks on the road up ahead, that a pack had gotten bold and gone after a couple of dogs just yesterday, and it was not safe for two young girls to be walking alone. Haley looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether to believe him. The thing was, coyote problems were not unusual in that area, and we had been warned about them before by our grandfather, who kept a rifle by the back door for that exact reason. So the story made sense, and the man seemed to know that it would. He offered us a ride the rest of the way to the store, saying it would only take a few minutes, and he was heading that direction anyway. I hesitated, feeling something heavy settle in my chest that I could not explain, a reluctance that had no logical source. But Haley was already moving toward the truck, and I did not want to seem like a scared little kid in front of her. I climbed into the cab after her, settling onto the cracked leather bench seat that smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and faintly chemical that I could not identify. The man pulled back onto the road, and for a minute everything seemed normal. Just the rumble of the engine and the dust billowing behind us through the rear window. Then I noticed we were not going the right way. The road to Perkins continued straight for another 2 miles before curving slightly east toward the village center. But this man had turned left onto a narrow side path that led into the overgrown Jennings property. I knew that land well because Haley and I had explored the edges of it many times, daring each other to get closer to the collapsing barn with its dark windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as the main road disappeared behind a wall of tall wild grass, and my heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said this was a shortcut that would get us to the store faster. But that was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because this road led nowhere except deeper into abandoned farmland. Haley grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, her palm slick with sweat. I looked at her face and saw my own fear reflected back at me, her eyes wide and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The man kept talking in that same cheerful tone, telling us about the weather and the wheat harvest and other things that meant nothing, filling the air with words so we would not have time to think. But I was thinking, and what I was thinking was that nobody knew where we were. Our grandparents expected us to be gone for at least 2 hours, and if we disappeared into these fields, no one would even start looking for us until lunchtime. The truck slowed down as we approached the old Jennings barn, and I saw that someone had been here recently because there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and the padlock on the barn door had been replaced with a shiny new one. The man pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine, and in that sudden silence I could hear birds singing somewhere far away and the tick of the cooling motor. He turned to look at us with that same terrible smile, and he said we should wait here for just a minute while he checked on something inside the barn. That was when Haley screamed. It was not a word or a call for help, just a raw animal sound of pure terror that seemed to unlock something in both of us. She yanked the door handle and threw herself out of the truck before I even understood what was happening, and I followed her a half-second later, my feet hitting the ground hard enough to send a jolt of pain up through my ankles. The man shouted something behind us, his friendly voice gone sharp and ugly, but I did not turn around to see if he was chasing us. We ran into the tall grass, pushing through stalks that whipped against our faces and arms. our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Haley somewhere to my left, crashing through the vegetation, and I angled toward the sound of her footsteps. The grass was so high that I could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and I kept expecting to feel a hand close around my arm or my hair at any moment. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I did not slow down. Could not slow down. Because somewhere behind us was a man who had taken us to an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and I knew with absolute certainty what that meant. We ran until the grass thinned out and gave way to a plowed field, the dirt soft and uneven beneath our feet. I stumbled twice and caught myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw against rocks and dry clods of earth. Haley was crying now, loud hiccuping sobs that she could not control, and I grabbed her wrist and pulled her along because we could not stop yet. In the distance, I could see a farmhouse with a red roof and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, and I pointed toward it and told Haley to keep going. My whole body was shaking, not just my hands but my legs and my jaw and something deep inside my chest that would not stop trembling no matter how hard I tried to control it. We crossed what felt like miles of open field, exposed and vulnerable under that bright blue sky, before we finally reached the farmhouse and I started pounding on the door with both fists. A woman in her 60s opened it, flour on her apron and confusion on her face, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and desperate, and I could see that she did not understand. Her name was Loretta Grimes, and she sat us down at her kitchen table and gave us glasses of water while she called our grandparents. Haley could not stop crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, and I held her hand across the table while I tried to answer Loretta's questions. I told her about the man in the green truck, about the lie he told us about coyotes, about the turn onto the side road and the barn with the new padlock. Loretta's face went pale as I spoke, and she picked up the phone again to call the sheriff's office in the next town over. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of fear and fury that I had never seen before, and he wrapped both of us in his arms so tight I could barely breathe. The sheriff's deputy showed up an hour after that, a young man with a notepad who wrote down everything I said and nodded seriously but did not seem particularly alarmed. He told us the description matched several trucks in the county and that without a license plate number, there was not much they could do. My grandmother kept saying we should never have been walking alone, that it was her fault for sending us, and the guilt in her voice made me feel worse than anything else that had happened that day. The following weeks were strange and uncomfortable in ways I did not expect. Word spread through Ridgefield quickly, as it does in small towns, but the reaction was not what I thought it would be. Some people believed us completely and praised us for being smart enough to run, but others, including people I had known my whole life, suggested that we had misunderstood the situation. Maybe the man really was just trying to help, they said. Maybe we panicked for no reason and made a nice farmer look like a criminal. One older man at the general store told my grandfather that city kids were always too suspicious, too dramatic, and that we probably scared a good Samaritan half to death by jumping out of his truck like that. The doubt hurt almost as much as the memory of that day, and Haley and I stopped talking about what happened because it seemed like nobody wanted to hear it. We finished out the summer at our grandparents' house, but we never walked to the store alone again. And we never explored the old Jennings property, and we slept in the same bed every night because neither of us could stand to be alone in the dark. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, my mother called with news that made her voice crack and tremble through the phone line. A man had been arrested in Carroll County, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield, after attempting to force a 9-year-old boy into his vehicle outside a gas station. The boy's father had been inside paying and came out just in time to see what was happening, and he held the man down until police arrived. The vehicle was a dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper. When investigators searched the property where the man lived, a rented trailer on the edge of an old farming community, they found things that my mother would not describe to me no matter how many times I asked. She only said that the man had done this before, in other counties, in other states, and that some of those children had never been found. I sat on the edge of my bed in my childhood room, the phone pressed against my ear, And I thought about that barn with the shiny new padlock and the fresh tire tracks in the mud. I thought about how close we had come to being part of a story that ended very differently. A story that might have ended with our photographs on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across Montana. Haley and I are adults now, both of us with families of our own, and we have only talked about that day a handful of times in all the years since. But I think about it more often than I would like to admit. Usually when I see my own daughter walking home from school or riding her bike around the neighborhood. I taught her early about strangers and cars and the lies that dangerous people tell, and I made sure she understood that politeness is never more important than survival. She knows that if something feels wrong, she should run first and explain later, and she knows that I will always believe her no matter what anyone else says. The man who drove that green truck is serving multiple life sentences now, locked away in a place where he cannot hurt anyone else. But sometimes late at night when sleep will not come, I still see his face through that rolled down window. I still see those yellowed teeth stretched into that wide, unnatural smile. And I still hear his friendly voice, asking if we were the Whitaker grandkids heading to the store. And I wonder how many other children heard that same voice, saw that same smile, and were not lucky enough or fast enough to escape into the tall grass before it was too late. My cousin got me the job at the grain facility out near Harlow County, about 40 minutes from the nearest town with a stoplight. He worked for the agricultural company that owned the place and said they needed someone to cover night shifts for a few weeks, while their regular guy recovered from back surgery. Simple work, he promised. Walk the perimeter twice a night, log any delivery trucks that came through, check the temperature gauges on the storage bays, and make sure nobody was messing around on the property. The pay was decent for what amounted to sitting in a small office trailer and reading most of the night. I had just finished my teaching certification and was waiting for the school district to finalize my contract for the fall semester, so the timing worked out. My girlfriend thought I was crazy for taking a job in the middle of nowhere, but we needed the money, and 6 weeks of overnight shifts seemed like easy cash. The facility itself sat on about 15 acres of flat land surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides and a county road on the 4th. There were 6 massive grain silos, a long metal warehouse for equipment storage, and 3 smaller storage bays used for overflow during harvest season. The office trailer where I spent most of my time was positioned near the front gate, close enough to the road that I could see headlights coming from a mile away. My first 3 shifts were exactly what my cousin described. Boring in the best way possible. I did my rounds at midnight and again at 4 in the morning, wrote down a whole lot of nothing in the logbook, and spent the rest of my time grading practice tests I had created for the class I would be teaching in September. The only company I had was the security cameras, 8 of them total, feeding grainy black and white footage to a monitor that looked like it belonged in the 90s. The night sounds out there took some getting used to. The grain settling in the silos made these deep groaning noises, and the wind coming across the fields would rattle the metal siding on the warehouse something fierce. It was my 4th shift when I noticed the first thing that seemed wrong. During my midnight round, I walked past Storage Bay 2, one of the smaller units used for equipment and spare parts, and saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading up to the roll-up door. Now that door was supposed to stay locked, and according to the schedule my cousin had given me, no deliveries were expected until the following Tuesday. I checked the lock and it was secure, so I figured maybe someone from the day crew had pulled up there earlier and I just had not noticed the tracks before. I wrote it down in the logbook anyway, the way I was supposed to, and finished my round without thinking much more about it. But when I came back around at 4 in the morning, I noticed something else. There was a dark stain on the concrete pad right outside the bay door, maybe 2 feet wide, like someone had spilled something and tried to wash it away. The edges were still wet. I crouched down and touched it, and my fingers came up with this faint pinkish color. Looked diluted, like whatever it was had been hosed down but not completely cleaned. I stood there for a while, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe one of the day workers had cut himself and cleaned it up. Maybe someone hit a deer on the road and pulled in to check their vehicle. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but something kept nagging at me. Why would anyone wash down a spill at a grain facility in the middle of the night? I took a few pictures with my phone, just in case, and went back to the trailer. I thought about calling my cousin, but it was almost 5 in the morning and I did not want to wake him up over what was probably nothing. The rest of that shift, I kept looking at those pictures, zooming in like I was going to find some answer hidden in the pixels. When the day supervisor showed up at 6 to relieve me, I mentioned the tire tracks and the stain. He was this older guy named Dwight, been working there for 15 years, and he just shrugged and said it was probably hydraulic fluid from one of the tractors. He did not seem concerned at all, so I let it go, but I saved those pictures anyway. 2 nights later, I found the tools. I was doing my 4 in the morning round, walking along the back side of the warehouse where the security cameras did not reach. There was a dead zone back there, maybe 60 feet of space between the building and the fence line that nobody had bothered to cover. I almost tripped over a canvas bag sitting in the weeds near the drainage ditch. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a set of bolt cutters, a crowbar, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. None of it belonged to the facility. I knew every piece of equipment in that warehouse because I had walked through it during my orientation, and this stuff was not on any inventory list. The bolt cutters still had price tags on them from a hardware store I did not recognize. I stood there holding that bag, my heart going a mile a minute, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some random stuff that blew in or got dumped by kids messing around. But bolt cutters and duct tape do not just appear together by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it, marked the spot in my head, and walked back to the trailer as fast as I could without running. I called my cousin that morning after my shift ended. Told him everything, the tire tracks, the stain, the bag of tools. He got quiet for a long time, which was not like him at all. Finally, he said I should keep my head down and not mention any of this to Dwight or anyone else at the facility. He said he would make some calls and figure out what was going on, but in the meantime, I should just do my job and stay in the trailer as much as possible. That advice did not sit right with me. I asked him what he thought was happening, and he just said some of the storage bays got leased out to third parties, and he did not always know what they were being used for. The way he said it made me feel like he knew more than he was telling me. I barely slept that day. I lay in bed at my apartment staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Drug storage maybe, stolen merchandise. I even thought about human trafficking, but that seemed too extreme, too much like something from a documentary. By the time I drove back out to the facility that evening for my next shift, I had almost talked myself into quitting. But I needed that money, and I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting to a bunch of coincidences. That night changed everything. I got to the facility around 9, same as always, and Dwight handed off the keys without much conversation. He seemed tired, distracted, and he left quicker than usual. I settled into the trailer, made some coffee, and started going through my lesson plans. Around 11, I noticed headlights on the security monitor, a truck coming down the access road from the back of the property, not from the main county road where deliveries usually came. That road was supposed to be gated and locked, only used during harvest season when they needed extra access for the big equipment. I watched the truck pull around behind Storage Bay 2, the same bay where I had found the tire tracks. It sat there for about 10 minutes with its lights off, and then it left the same way it came. No one got out that I could see. No one approached the trailer or checked in with me. According to every protocol I had been given, any vehicle on the property at night was supposed to log in with the night watchman. That was literally my entire job. I wrote down the time and a description of the truck, white full-size pickup, no visible plates from the camera angle, and I sat there wondering if I should go check the bay or just pretend I had not seen anything. I waited about an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk out there. The night was warm and still, no wind for once, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I took my flashlight and walked the long way around, staying close to the silos where I could duck out of sight if I needed to. When I got to Storage Bay 2, I noticed the padlock was different. The old one had been brass, weathered and scratched up from years of use. This one was silver, brand new, with a black rubber coating around the shackle. Someone had changed the lock, I put my ear against the roll-up door. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a movie, but I did not know what else to do. And I heard nothing at first. Just the metal ticking as it cooled down from the day's heat. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. Voices. Muffled, impossible to make out the words, but definitely human voices coming from inside the bay. And then a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately like someone had been hurt, and then silenced. I backed away from that door so fast I almost fell over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to convince myself it was something else. An animal, a radio, anything but what it sounded like. I made it back to the trailer in what felt like seconds, locked the door behind me, and sat there staring at the security monitors with my phone in my hand. I should have called the police right then. I know that now. But I kept thinking about what my cousin had said, about keeping my head down, about how some of the bays were leased to third parties. What if I was wrong? What if I called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? And I lost my job and my cousin lost his job, and I looked like a paranoid idiot. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, arguing with myself. And then I saw a movement on the monitor. Someone was walking toward the trailer. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, coming from the direction of Storage Bay 2. He was not rushing, not trying to hide. He walked like someone who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be on that property in the middle of the night. I watched him get closer and closer until he walked right out of the camera's frame, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the trailer door. He knocked 3 times, slow and deliberate. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Through the small window next to the door, I could see the outline of his shape, just standing there, waiting. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost friendly. He said he knew I was in there and that we needed to have a conversation about what I had seen over the past few nights. He said it in a way that made it clear he already knew everything. The pictures I took, the bag of tools I found, the fact that I had been asking questions. He said I seemed like a smart guy, and smart guys understood when it was better to look the other way. He said some people made good money just by not seeing things, and that could be me if I wanted it to be. He never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and I did not say a single word. After what felt like forever, he knocked once more, just once, and then the footsteps moved away. I watched on the monitor as he walked back toward the storage bay, got into a dark SUV I had not noticed before, and drove off using that back access road. I did not finish that shift. The second his taillights disappeared from the camera, I grabbed my keys and walked straight to my car. I did not clock out, did not leave a note, did not call anyone. I just drove. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes back to town. I called my cousin the next morning and told him I was done, that I was not going back to that facility ever again. He did not argue. He did not ask questions, he just said he understood, and that he would take care of it with the company. A week later, I saw on the local news that there had been a fire at an agricultural storage facility in Harlow County. Electrical malfunction, they said. Storage Bay 2 was completely destroyed. No injuries reported, no investigation opened. The facility shut down for repairs and never reopened. My cousin stopped returning my calls after that. We have not spoken in almost 2 years now, and when I see him at family gatherings, he acts like nothing ever happened. Like those 6 weeks just got erased from both our memories. I never found out what was really going on in that storage bay. I never found out who that man was or what happened to whoever made that sound I heard through the door. Some nights I still think about it. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through everything I should have done differently. I should have called the police that first night when I found the stain. I should have trusted my gut instead of listening to my cousin. I should have done something instead of just running away, but I did not, and now I have to live with that. The teaching job came through a few weeks after everything happened, and I threw myself into work, tried to move on, tried to convince myself that whatever was happening at that facility was not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I will be driving at night and I will pass some industrial building sitting alone in the dark, lights off, nothing moving, and I will feel this cold twist in my chest. Because I know now that there are places like that everywhere. Places where things happen that nobody talks about, and there are people whose job it is to make sure nobody ever finds out. I was almost one of those people. Sometimes I wonder if the only reason I am still here, still able to tell this story, is because I was smart enough to stay quiet and scared enough to run. And I do not know which part of that bothers me more. Rural Kansas has a way of making you feel both free and completely exposed at the same time. When my dad passed in 2017, he left me 47 acres of farmland that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it dirt cheap during the Depression. My wife Sheila and I had been renting a cramped apartment in Denver for 6 years by then, and with our twin daughters about to start kindergarten, the timing felt right. We moved in that September, right around my high school reunion, which made me realize how much time had slipped by since I left that small town as a kid, dreaming of city life. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, almost a mile from the county route, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and a few scattered oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The previous tenant, a guy named Jerry Mullins who helped my dad maintain the place after his stroke, had moved out 3 months before we arrived. The house needed work, but it was ours, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe. The trouble started in late October, maybe 6 weeks after we settled in. We had been dealing with the usual rural annoyances: hunters cutting across the back acres without permission, teenagers using the empty barn for weekend parties, that kind of thing. Sheila found beer cans and cigarette butts near the old grain silo one morning, and that was the final straw for her. She wanted a gate, something solid with a good lock, to keep people from just driving onto our land whenever they felt like it. I agreed, mostly to ease her mind, and spent a whole Saturday installing a heavy steel gate at the entrance where our dirt road met the county route. I bought a thick padlock from the hardware store in town, one of those hardened steel ones that cost almost $40. We each kept a key, and I hid a spare inside the hollow fence post nearby, just in case. That first night with the gate locked, I remember Sheila squeezing my hand at dinner and saying she finally felt safe out here. I believed her when she said it, and I believed it myself. 3 days later, I woke up around 5 in the morning to let the dog out and noticed the gate was wide open. Not broken, not forced, just open, swinging gently in the November wind like someone had casually unlocked it and forgotten to close it behind them. I walked the whole length of that dirt road in my bathrobe and boots, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of what happened. Nothing. No trash, no footprints that I could make out in the dark, no indication that anyone had even been there. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly, even though I could picture myself clicking that padlock shut and tugging it twice to make sure. Sheila gave me a look when I came back inside, the kind of look that said she was trusting me to keep us safe out here. I promised her it would not happen again, and I meant it. That evening, I checked the lock 3 separate times before coming inside for dinner, but it did happen again. The following Monday morning, Sheila was the one who found it, gate wide open, padlock hanging loose on the chain like it had been gently placed there by someone with all the time in the world. This time, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle that had driven right up our road sometime during the night. I followed those tracks almost halfway to the house before they curved off toward the old barn and disappeared into the harder ground near the equipment shed. I searched that barn top to bottom, checked every stall, climbed up into the hayloft where dust hung thick in the morning light. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had definitely been on our property. Someone with a key. I called the sheriff that afternoon, and Deputy Nolan came out to take a report, but he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. "Probably just kids," he said. "Probably someone messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but those tire tracks told a different story. I replaced the lock that same week. Drove 30 miles to a different hardware store because I did not want to buy from the same place, thinking maybe somehow someone had gotten a duplicate made. This new padlock was even heavier, a different brand with keys that had a unique pattern cut into them. I threw away the old lock entirely and made sure only Sheila and I had copies this time. No spare hidden in the fence post, nothing. For about 10 days, everything seemed normal. The gate stayed locked, the road stayed empty, and I started to convince myself that Deputy Nolan had been right after all. Maybe it really was just some kids playing a prank, and once they realized we were serious about security, they moved on to easier targets. Sheila stopped checking the windows every night before bed. The girls started playing outside again without one of us hovering nearby. I let my guard down, and that was exactly when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning in mid-November when I walked out to check the gate and found something that made me stop dead in the middle of the road. The gate was locked, completely secure, chain wrapped tight, padlock clicked shut just like I had left it. But it was not my padlock. The one hanging there was silver instead of black, a completely different brand, with a keyhole that my keys would never fit. Someone had come onto our property during the night, removed my lock entirely, and replaced it with their own. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not a prank. This was not teenagers looking for a place to drink beer. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know they could come and go whenever they pleased, that no lock I bought would keep them out. They were sending a message, and the message was clear. This property belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. I cut that lock off with bolt cutters and bought a third one that afternoon, but my hands were unsteady the whole drive home. Sheila wanted to move. She said it plainly over dinner that night, the girls already in bed, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. She said she did not feel safe anymore, that whoever was doing this knew too much about our routines, about when we were asleep, about how to get in without leaving a trace. I tried to calm her down, told her we would figure it out. But the truth was I did not have answers. I called Deputy Nolan again the next morning, and he came out to look at the new lock I had cut off, turning it over in his hands like it was a curiosity rather than evidence. He said there was not much he could do without catching someone in the act. No crime had technically been committed, no theft, no property damage beyond the locks themselves. He suggested we install cameras, maybe motion lights, something to discourage whoever was doing this. It felt like being told to solve my own problem, but I did not know what else to do. That night I ordered 2 trail cameras online, the kind hunters use to photograph deer, and paid extra for overnight shipping. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, and I spent most of that afternoon mounting them. One pointed directly at the gate, hidden inside a wooden birdhouse I nailed to a tree about 20 feet back, and another aimed at the dirt road from the corner of our front porch. They were motion activated, designed to capture clear images even in total darkness using infrared. I tested them a dozen times, walking back and forth in front of each one until I was satisfied they were working perfectly. Sheila watched me from the kitchen window the whole time, and when I came inside, she hugged me longer than usual. We both knew that whatever those cameras captured might change everything. That night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if the motion alerts had triggered. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, quiet, still. The gate locked tight every morning when I walked out to check. By Friday, I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves had scared whoever it was away. If just knowing they were being watched was enough to make them stop. I should have known better than to hope for something that simple. Saturday morning, I woke up to 3 motion alerts on my phone, all time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mouth went dry before I even opened the app. The first image showed headlights approaching the gate from the county route, just 2 bright circles floating in the darkness. The second image was clearer. A pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe blue or green, parked right in front of the gate with its engine still running. I could see exhaust rising in the cold air, caught by the infrared flash. The third image is the one that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stay there for a long time. A man stood at the gate, his back to the camera, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was not cutting the lock. He was not forcing anything. He had a key in his hand, and he was unlocking my gate the same way I did every single day, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. The camera caught him mid-motion, his arm extended, the lock already open in his other hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. I showed Sheila the photos and watched her face go pale. She asked me if I recognized the truck, and I told her I did not. But something about it nagged at me. The shape of it, the way the tailgate sat slightly crooked like it had been bent in an accident years ago. I spent the next hour going through every image the cameras had captured, frame by frame, looking for anything that might help identify this person. The camera near the house had triggered too, showing the same truck driving slowly up our road, headlights off now, moving like a shadow through the darkness toward the barn. There were 6 images total of the vehicle parked behind the equipment shed, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before it turned around and left the same way it came. 40 minutes. This person had been on our property for 40 minutes while my wife and daughters slept in their beds, while I lay dreaming not 200 yards away. I called Deputy Nolan again, and this time he actually sounded interested. He asked me to email him the photos, said he would run the truck through some databases, see if anything came up. But I was done waiting for the sheriff to solve this. I needed to find out who this was myself. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the diner where most of the old-timers gathered for breakfast. I figured if anyone knew about a dark pickup truck with a crooked tailgate, it would be someone who had lived in this county their whole life. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, then started asking questions as casually as I could. Mentioned I was looking for someone who might do some work on my property, someone who knew the area well. A woman named Betty who worked the register overheard me and asked which property I was talking about. When I told her, she got quiet for a second before saying I should talk to Jerry Mullins. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Jerry Mullins, the same man who had worked for my father, who had lived on our property as a caretaker for almost 3 years before we moved in. Betty said Jerry had a dark green Ford pickup, older model, with a dented tailgate from when he backed into a fence post years ago. She said he still lived about 15 miles north, in a trailer near the creek, and that he had been having money troubles ever since my father let him go. I did not correct her. My father never let Jerry go. Jerry had simply stopped showing up after my dad got too sick to manage the property anymore. I thanked Betty, left a $10 bill on the counter, and drove straight to the address she gave me. I found Jerry Mullins sitting on a plastic chair outside his trailer, smoking a cigarette and watching the road like he had been expecting someone. The truck was parked right there beside him. Dark green, crooked tailgate, the same vehicle from my camera footage. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not even stand up when I got out of my car and walked toward him. I asked him straight out if he had been coming onto my property at night, and he just took a long drag of his cigarette before nodding slowly, like I had asked him about the weather. He said he still had keys. He said my father had given him copies years ago, back when he was trusted to come and go as he pleased, and he had never seen a reason to give them back. When I asked him why, what he was doing out there in the middle of the night, he looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. I still cannot tell which. He said he had been storing things in the barn. Equipment, tools, some furniture he could not fit in his trailer. He said he figured no one was using the space anyway, and he did not think it would matter. 3 years of my father being sick, then dead, and Jerry had just kept coming and going like the property was still his responsibility. Like nothing had changed at all. I wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to grab him by his jacket and demand to know what gave him the right. What made him think he could terrorize my family like that? Make my wife afraid to sleep in her own home? But looking at him sitting there in that plastic chair, his clothes worn thin, his trailer rusting at the edges, I mostly just felt tired. I told him to give me the keys, all of them, every copy he had ever made. He went inside without a word and came back with a small metal ring holding 4 different keys, each one labeled with faded tape that had my father's handwriting on it. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He handed them over and I stood there holding them, feeling the weight of all those years my father had trusted this man. I asked Jerry if he understood that he could not come back, that this was over now. He nodded and stubbed out his cigarette on the arm of his chair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to scare anyone, that he always came late at night specifically so he would not bother us. Like that made it better. Like the intent behind the fear somehow erased the fear itself. I drove home and told Sheila everything. We searched the barn together that afternoon and found exactly what Jerry had described. Boxes of old tools, a broken generator, some water-damaged furniture stacked in the corner of the hayloft. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just the sad remnants of a man who could not let go of a place that was no longer his. I changed every lock on the property that weekend, installed new deadbolts, and added 2 more cameras just to be safe. Deputy Nolan closed the case without filing charges after I told him I did not want to press the issue. Jerry was pathetic more than criminal, and dragging him through the courts would not undo the weeks of fear we had already lived through. Sheila still checks the gate every morning before I wake up. Sometimes I catch her standing at the window late at night, watching the road, waiting for headlights that I pray will never come again. We talk about selling the place sometimes, starting over somewhere else, but this land belonged to my family for almost a century, and I'm not ready to let one troubled man take that from us. The locks are changed, the cameras are watching, and Jerry Mullins has not come back. But I still keep those 4 keys he gave me, tucked in a drawer beside my bed, where I can look at them whenever I need to remind myself that the thing I feared most was not a monster or a ghost. It was just a man with a key and nowhere else to go. Buying a house on 12 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia was supposed to be the best decision of my life. I had spent my 20s bouncing between cramped apartments in Richmond, sharing walls with people who screamed at each other at all hours, and when my grandmother passed and left me enough for a down payment, I did not hesitate. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1940s according to the county records, with a sagging porch, outdated kitchen cabinets, and a well pump that groaned every morning like it was in pain. But it sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and for the first time in my adult life, I could not hear a single neighbor. I worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, typing up doctor notes in my pajamas, so the isolation suited me perfectly. My closest neighbor was Harold Jennings, an 80-something widower who lived about a mile down the road. We had a deal where I checked on him twice a week and he kept an eye on my property when I was away. By June, I had been living there for 8 months, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. That Saturday started like any other weekend. I woke up around 9, made coffee, and spent most of the day at my desk finishing a backlog of transcription files. For dinner, I made spaghetti and watched a couple episodes of a true crime show on Netflix. Ironic, considering what happened later. Around 11, I took my dog Pepper outside for her last bathroom break of the night. She was a 6-year-old shelter mutt, brown and white patches with one floppy ear that never quite stood upright. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for early June in Virginia, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin. I stood on the porch watching Pepper sniff around the yard, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky, in a way you never see in the city. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Pepper finished her business, trotted back inside, and I locked the front door behind us. Checked the back door out of habit. Went to bed around midnight feeling completely safe. I do not know how long I had been asleep when Pepper started growling. It was not her normal growl, the one she did when she saw a squirrel through the window or heard a car drive by on the main road. This was low and sustained, coming from deep in her chest, and she was standing at my bedroom door facing the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had set her off. Then I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 steady knocks like someone was being polite about it. My first thought was that something had happened to Harold. Maybe he had fallen. Maybe he had walked over in some kind of confused state. He was getting up there in age, and I worried about him. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, Pepper staying right at my heels, still growling that low rumble. The front door had a small window at the top, but it was dark outside and I could not see much. I also had a window to the left of the door that looked out onto the porch, covered by thin curtains. I did not turn on any lights. Something told me not to, some instinct I cannot really explain. So I just stood there in the dark, trying to see through the curtain. Then came another knock, and a voice, a man's voice, calm and friendly. He said his car had broken down about half a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if he could use my phone to call someone for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on these back roads where cell service was spotty at best. But it was almost 2 in the morning, and I was a woman alone, and something about the situation made every muscle in my body tighten. I moved closer to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch to get a better look at who was standing on my porch. He looked normal. That was the thing that made it so hard to know what to do. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain dark t-shirt, average build, short brown hair. He had his hands in his pockets and he was standing a few feet back from the door, not pressed up against it like someone desperate or aggressive would be. He looked like a regular guy who had car trouble. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting all those crime documentaries get to my head. But Pepper was still growling, her hackles raised all the way down her spine, and that dog had never been wrong about people. I had seen her wag her tail at complete strangers, and I had seen her bark at men who later turned out to be bad news. She had instincts I had learned to trust. So instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. I told him I could call someone for him, asked what number he needed. He said he appreciated that, gave me a name, said his brother lived about 20 miles away and could come pick him up. He even gave me a phone number. It all sounded so normal, so reasonable. I had my phone in my hand, ready to dial, when I glanced out the side window again. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a half moon. But my eyes had adjusted to the darkness by then. The man was still standing there, patient, waiting. And that is when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was a deer, we had plenty of those around. But the shape was wrong. It was upright. It was a person, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, heading toward the back of my house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked back at the man on the porch, and he was still standing there with that same calm expression, like he had all the time in the world. He had no idea I had seen the other one. Or maybe he knew exactly what was happening and this whole thing was part of a plan. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying to think. My mind was racing through options. I could call 911, but the nearest sheriff's station was at least 25 minutes away, and I had no idea how much time I had. I could call Harold, but what was an 80-year-old man going to do? I thought about the back door, wondered if it was really locked, wondered if that second person was already testing it. The man on the porch knocked again, a little louder this time, and asked if everything was okay. His voice was still friendly, but there was something underneath it now, a hint of impatience. I told him through the door that I was calling his brother right now, that help would be on the way soon. I was stalling, buying myself time to figure out what to do. I moved quickly and quietly through the dark house to the kitchen, where I could see the backyard through the window above the sink. The second figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the house, and I could see it was a man, bigger than the one on the porch, wearing dark clothes and some kind of cap. He was not even trying to hide anymore. He was just walking toward my back door like he belonged there. I grabbed the biggest knife from the block on the counter. It was not much, but it was something. Then I went back to the front of the house and told the man on the porch that I was not going to open the door. I said I had called 911 and the police were on their way. It was a lie. I had not called yet, but I needed him to believe it. There was a long pause. I could not see his face from where I was standing, but I could feel the shift in the air, like the whole situation had changed in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The friendliness was gone. He said something like, "Come on, I just need to use your phone. Why are you making this difficult?" But it was not a question. It was a statement. And then I heard the back door handle rattle. Not a knock, not a polite request. Someone was trying to open it, testing to see if it was locked. Pepper went absolutely crazy, barking and snarling and throwing herself toward the back of the house. The man on the porch started pounding on the front door now. Not knocking anymore, pounding, and he was saying something, but I could not hear it over Pepper and the blood rushing in my ears. I finally called 911. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking fast, too fast, trying to explain that two men were trying to break into my house, that I was alone, that I needed help right now. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me to stay on the line, that she was sending units my way. But I knew how far away they were. I knew I was on my own for at least 20 minutes, probably more. The pounding on the front door stopped suddenly, and that silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood in the hallway between the front and back of the house, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Pepper pressed against my leg, still growling. I could hear footsteps on the porch, then nothing. Then I heard glass break somewhere at the back of the house. Not the door, one of the windows. The one in the small laundry room that I always meant to put a better lock on but never did. Pepper bolted toward the sound, barking so loud it hurt my ears, and I heard a man curse, and then more glass breaking as he tried to clear the frame. I ran to the laundry room doorway and saw a dark shape halfway through the window, one leg already inside. I did not think. I just reacted. I screamed at him, something I do not even remember, and I swung that knife at his arm. I felt it connect, felt resistance, and he yelled and pulled back out the window so fast he cut himself more on the broken glass. There was blood on my kitchen knife and blood on the window frame, and I was shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what was happening, and I was trying to tell her, but the words were not coming out right. I backed away from the window, expecting him to come through again or expecting the other one to try the front, but for a moment, everything went quiet. Pepper was still barking, but it was different now, more frantic, like she was trying to track movements she could hear, but I could not. I kept switching my attention between the front door and the broken window, waiting for someone to come through, knowing I could not defend both at the same time. Then I heard a car engine start. It was faint at first, somewhere down my gravel driveway, and then it got louder and I heard tires spinning on loose rock. I ran to the front window and saw taillights disappearing down the road, moving fast with no headlights on. They were leaving. I did not understand it at first. I was still braced for someone to come crashing through a door or window. But the sounds outside faded, and then there was nothing but crickets and Pepper whimpering beside me. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher for another 18 minutes until I saw the red and blue lights coming up my driveway. 2 deputies came to the door and I finally unlocked it, still holding that knife, still shaking. One of them was a woman named Hartley, who took the knife gently from my hand and led me to sit down while her partner cleared the house. They found blood on the laundry room window, on the ground outside, and a trail of it leading into the woods where they must have parked their car somewhere out of sight. The deputies told me I did the right thing, that I was lucky, that most people would have opened that door. The sheriff's department investigated for weeks, but never found them. No matching DNA in the system, no witnesses, no abandoned car with a flat tire anywhere near my road. It was like they had never existed. But here is the part that still keeps me up at night, even 2 years later. About 3 weeks after it happened, a deputy called to tell me they had connected my case to 2 other incidents in the county from the previous year. Same pattern. A man knocking on a door late at night with a story about car trouble. A second person waiting in the shadows. The other 2 houses, the people had opened their doors. One woman was beaten badly and robbed. The other, an older couple, the husband did not survive. They had been targeting isolated homes, places where help was far away, places where people still trusted strangers enough to open their doors at night. I never found out if they were caught. I moved back to Richmond 6 months later. I still have Pepper, and she still growls sometimes at night for no reason I can see. When she does, I do not go back to sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a knock that I hope never comes. "14 years of warehouse work in New Jersey, had left me burned out in ways I did not fully understand, until I quit. When my buddy Glenn mentioned a seasonal crop management gig in rural Virginia, I jumped at it without thinking twice. My engagement had collapsed the previous spring. I was renting a depressing studio apartment, and the idea of wide-open spaces sounded like medicine. The contract was simple: 6 months overseeing soybean fields for an agricultural company, with a rent-free farmhouse included as part of the deal. I loaded my Ford pickup and drove 5 hours south on a Wednesday morning in early September 2018. The property sat at the end of a gravel road called Hendricks Mill Lane, about 12 miles from the nearest town with a grocery store. The farmhouse itself was nothing special: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But the land stretched out flat and golden under the late summer sun, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first week passed without any trouble. I spent my days learning the irrigation system, checking soil moisture levels, and driving the perimeter of the 300 acres I was responsible for. The nearest neighbor, according to my contract paperwork, was a property about half a mile east, but the county records listed it as unoccupied, owned by some agricultural trust based out of Richmond. I could see the outline of a farmhouse and a large barn from my kitchen window, sitting dark against the tree line. No cars in the driveway, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The isolation took some getting used to, especially at night when the silence became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in bed. But I kept busy, called my mom every few days, and started settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. It was on the 8th night, a Tuesday, when I first noticed the lights. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I glanced out the bathroom window and saw a faint yellow glow coming from the supposedly empty property to the east. A single light, maybe in an upstairs window, burning steady through the darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the trust had sent someone to check on the property, or perhaps a caretaker stopped by occasionally. I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, but I kept thinking about that light. The next morning, I drove the perimeter as usual and slowed down when I passed the eastern boundary. From the road, the neighboring farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as before, peeling white paint, overgrown grass pushing up through cracks in the driveway, a rusted mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. No vehicles anywhere. I parked my truck and walked closer to the fence line, trying to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. The place looked like it had been empty for years. I even checked my phone to confirm what I remembered from the county records, and there it was in black and white. Property owned by Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust. Status unoccupied, last recorded activity dated back to 2014. I drove back to my farmhouse feeling stupid for even worrying about it. Old houses have electrical quirks, timers on lights, all kinds of explanations. But then it happened again that same night. This time I was sitting on the back porch around 10, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets, when I saw not one but 3 lights come on in sequence across the neighboring property. First the upstairs window, then something on the ground floor, then a light inside the barn. They stayed on for maybe 20 minutes, then went dark one by one in reverse order. I sat there with my beer getting warm in my hand, watching that dark silhouette against the tree line, waiting for something else to happen. It did not. The property just sat there, black and silent, like it had been abandoned all along. I went inside and locked every door, which felt ridiculous given that I had not locked anything since arriving. That night I slept poorly, waking up twice to sounds I could not identify. A low rumble that might have been a vehicle on a distant road, a rhythmic creaking that was probably just the house settling. In the morning I found myself checking the windows before I even made coffee, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The following Saturday I drove into town to pick up supplies and decided to ask around about the neighboring property. The town was called Burkeville, a small cluster of buildings centered around a gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Maxine's that seemed to serve as the local gathering spot. I grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up in a bun. Her name tag said Darlene. When she brought my food, I mentioned I was working the Henderson contract out on Hendricks Mill Lane, and she nodded like she already knew. Small towns are like that. I asked her about the property to the east of mine, the one owned by some agricultural trust, and her expression changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Not fear exactly, more like caution. She said she did not know much about it, that properties changed hands a lot around here, and then she moved down the counter to refill someone else's coffee. I tried asking the guy sitting 2 stools over, a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap who had been eating pancakes in silence. He looked at me for a long moment, syrup still dripping from his fork, and said something I will never forget. Best not to get involved in other people's boundaries out here. I pressed him on what that meant, but he just shook his head and went back to his pancakes. The whole diner had gone quiet, and I became aware that several people were watching me with expressions that ranged from pity to something harder, something like warning. I finished my eggs without tasting them and left a bigger tip than usual, hoping that might loosen someone up. It did not. Outside, I ran into an older man loading bags of fertilizer into a pickup truck, and I tried one more time. I told him I was new to the area, just trying to understand the lay of the land, and asked if he knew anything about the property east of my place. He stopped loading and looked at me with pale blue eyes that had probably seen 70 winters or more. He said the land out there had history, that people who owned it tended to keep to themselves, and that I should do the same. When I asked what kind of history, he just climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had been going on for decades, speaking a language everyone understood but me. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed around 1 in the morning, not quite asleep but drifting in that halfway state, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate, crunching along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I got up and moved to the window without turning on any lights, keeping myself pressed against the wall so I could see out without being seen. A vehicle was rolling past my property on Hendricks Mill Lane. A large pickup truck or maybe an SUV, I could not tell for certain because it had no headlights on. Just a dark shape moving through the darker night, engine barely above idle. It passed my driveway and continued down the road toward the eastern property, then disappeared around a bend. I stood at that window for maybe 15 minutes waiting until I saw it come back the other way. Same speed, same silence, same absence of lights. This time it slowed even more as it passed my house, and I swear I could feel eyes scanning my windows, even though I could not see anyone inside the vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After it passed, I did not go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light off, watching the road through the window above the sink until the sun came up. The morning brought something worse. I walked the perimeter of my farmhouse the way I had started doing every day, checking for anything out of place, and that is when I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt beneath my bedroom window, 2 distinct boot prints, deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. The window itself was about 5 feet off the ground, too high to see in without effort, but if someone stood on their toes or brought something to stand on, they would have had a clear view of my bed. I crouched down and studied those prints, trying to memorize every detail. Work boots size 11 or 12 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. There were more prints leading away from the window, tracking through the grass toward the back of the property. I followed them for about 200 yards until they reached an old irrigation ditch that cut through the fields toward the eastern boundary. The ditch was dry and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years, but the vegetation had been trampled flat in a narrow path. Someone had been using this ditch as a corridor to access my property without being seen from the road. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. A deputy named Womack came out around 4, a tall man with a sunburned neck and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen everything twice. I showed him the footprints, which had dried and hardened in the midday heat, and walked him out to the irrigation ditch. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, nodding occasionally, writing nothing down. When I finished, He stood there looking out toward the eastern property for a long moment before speaking. He said that folks out here valued their privacy, that property lines could be complicated when you had old irrigation rights and shared access roads from decades past. I told him someone had been watching me through my bedroom window, and he said he understood my concern, but that there was not much he could do without more evidence. No crime had technically been committed. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything else happened, but the way he said it made me feel like he was just going through the motions. I watched his cruiser disappear down Hendricks Mill Lane and realized I was completely on my own out here. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom window and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. The next 3 days were quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from a surveyor or someone checking utility lines. Maybe the vehicle without headlights was just a local taking a shortcut who did not want to disturb anyone. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to focus on soil samples and irrigation schedules instead of what might be lurking in the darkness. But on the fourth night, a Wednesday, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Not imagined, not dreamed, real footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the old wooden boards. I lay perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, listening as they moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then they stopped right outside my front door. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, testing to see if it was locked. It was. The footsteps resumed, circling around the side of the house, pausing at each window. I tracked the sound as it moved, living room, kitchen, bathroom, until it reached the back door. Another doorknob test, another locked barrier. Then nothing. Silence so complete it roared in my ears. I did not move until sunlight started bleeding through the curtains, and when I finally got up to check, I found fresh boot prints circling the entire house. Same size, same wear pattern on the left heel. I decided I was done waiting for something worse to happen. That morning, I drove to the hardware store in Burkeville and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. I mounted it on a tree facing the irrigation ditch, angled to capture anyone coming onto my property from that direction. Then I bought a second one and placed it on the corner of my porch, aimed at the front door and the gravel driveway. The clerk who sold them to me, a young guy named Sutton with a patchy beard and nervous hands, asked if I was having trouble with wildlife. I told him something like that. He looked at me for a beat too long before ringing me up, and I got the sense he knew exactly what kind of trouble I was having. That night, I sat in my truck at the edge of the property with the engine off and the windows down, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars I had ordered online 2 days before. Around midnight, I saw them. 2 figures emerging from the barn on the neighboring property, moving across the field in my direction. They walked in single file, staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. I watched them enter the irrigation ditch about 300 yards out, and then I lost sight of them in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to start the truck and flood them with headlights, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until I heard the soft crunch of footsteps near my house. Then I laid on the horn for a solid 30 seconds. The sound shattered the night like a bomb. When I finally stopped, I heard running, fast, panicked, retreating toward the ditch. The trail cameras caught everything. 2 men, faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low, crossing onto my property around 12:15 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see they were carrying something, a duffel bag, maybe tools. I could not tell for certain. I saved the files to my phone and drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles north, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. The trooper who reviewed the footage, a woman named Kendrick with close-cropped gray hair and no patience for small talk, made some calls while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, she told me what the locals had refused to say. The property to the east had been flagged in a federal investigation. Something about illegal cultivation hidden in the back acreage, distribution networks running through rural properties with absentee owners. The agricultural trust was a front, and the people operating out of there had been watching me since the day I arrived, trying to figure out if I was law enforcement or just an unlucky contractor who had wandered into the wrong place. Trooper Kendrick arranged for me to break my lease that same day. No penalties, no questions. I packed everything I owned in under 2 hours and drove north without looking back. I found out later that a raid happened about 3 weeks after I left. Multiple arrests, the whole operation dismantled. Sometimes I still think about those nights alone in that farmhouse, the footsteps circling in the darkness, the eyes watching from the tree line. The countryside had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, so empty and quiet, but the silence was never emptiness. It was just everyone around me holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. At the time, my life felt small and quiet in a way I actually needed. I'd rented a lonely countryside house tucked between fields and looping back roads that only tractors and grain trucks seemed to know by heart. I worked remotely, kept odd hours, and barely saw another person once the sun went down. The house itself was old but solid, with thick doors, narrow windows, and a long gravel driveway that disappeared into darkness at night. Most evenings were spent with a lamp on, the wind moving the trees and the distant hum of insects. I liked how cut off it felt, like the world had decided to leave me alone for a while. That sense of isolation was the whole reason I chose the place. It never occurred to me that someone else might notice how alone I was. The first thing that caught my attention happened late at night, when I was rinsing a mug at the sink and the room briefly brightened. Headlights slid across the far wall, slow and deliberate, not like a car passing through. I stepped closer to the window and watched the beams creep along the edge of the property, then disappear just beyond the trees. It didn't bother me much at first. Farm vehicles move strangely, and the roads around there twisted in ways that didn't make sense unless you drove them daily. Still, it kept happening, always after midnight, always slow. Sometimes the lights would pause, idling somewhere I couldn't see, engine low and patient. When they finally moved on, the darkness felt heavier than before. A couple weeks later, new sounds joined the routine. Early mornings, just before the sky started to lighten, faint clicks and soft pressure came from the front door. It wasn't violent or rushed, more like someone checking a locked car in a parking lot. One morning it was the back door, another time a window frame near the laundry room. Whoever it was never stayed long, and nothing was damaged. I walked the house afterward, heart thumping, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. That somehow made it worse. Locks untouched meant the person testing them knew they could wait. The storm arrived without much warning, rolling in heavy and loud, flattening the fields with rain, and bending the trees until they groaned. The power cut out first, then the cell signal dropped to nothing, leaving the house humming with rain and silence. Candles barely pushed back the dark, and the wind kept hitting the walls like it was trying to listen through them. That was when the headlights came back, brighter this time, stopping so close the glow leaked under the curtains. I stood there realizing something with a clarity that made my chest ache. Whoever was outside hadn't been trying to get in before. They'd been learning the house, learning me, and waiting for the moment when no one could hear me call for help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind and the soft idle of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. The rain masked smaller sounds, but not all of them. Gravel shifted, slow footsteps pressing into wet ground, careful enough not to splash. A shadow moved past one of the side windows, tall and narrow, pausing where the glass met the frame. There was no rush in the movement, no panic. It felt practiced, like someone following steps they'd rehearsed in their head many times. I backed away from the window, keeping to the darker part of the room, trying to control my breathing as the house creaked around me. The first real contact came at the back door. Not a knock, not a bang, just the gentle turn of the handle testing the resistance. Metal whispered against metal. It stopped, then tried again, slower, as if whoever was outside wanted to feel exactly how much pressure it took. I moved through the hallway on bare feet, each board threatening to betray me with noise. The flashlight in my hand shook enough that the beam bounced along the walls. When I reached the kitchen, the handle stopped moving, replaced by a long, thoughtful silence. I imagined someone standing there in the rain, hand resting on the door, deciding what came next. Minutes stretched until time lost its shape. The storm howled, thunder rolling so close it rattled the cabinets. Then the testing began again, this time at a window near the living room. Fingers brushed the glass, slow and deliberate, tracing the edge like they were memorizing it. I crouched behind the couch, phone useless in my hand, and realized how completely cut off I was. No lights from neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but fields and dark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about breaking in fast. It was about waiting me out, seeing how long fear could do the work instead. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The headlights stayed for a while longer, washing the side of the house in white, then finally pulled away. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry and left the house unlocked behind me, gravel crunching too loud under my tires as I drove away. Later, a local deputy walked the property and found nothing but deep footprints pressed into the mud near every door and window. No sign of forced entry. I never went back. Whatever patience had been waiting for me out there didn't need another chance. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whole thing, those headlights, the quiet testing, sat with me like a shadow, one I couldn't outrun. It's easy to tell yourself things like, maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or there's a perfectly logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I still couldn't explain how someone could have learned that house so thoroughly without ever stepping foot inside, or why they'd only been testing, never forcing. There was no conclusion to the nightmare that made sense. No one came forward. No evidence was found. The sheriff's department gave me the usual keep an eye out talk and moved on. But I couldn't. A few months later, I did some digging trying to find answers, or at least make peace with the strange events. Turns out, a similar pattern had been reported in a nearby town years before. Another woman, renting another old farmhouse, had noticed headlights passing by her home, followed by strange behavior around her doors. She'd left too, but by the time she did, the sheriff had already dropped her case. She was never even given the chance to speak in person, her complaint buried in bureaucracy. Like mine, her story faded into nothingness. I still think about that night. The silence after the headlights disappeared was one of the loudest things I've ever heard. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. I've learned a few things in the time since. How fragile a sense of safety can be. How quickly it can be snatched away. But there's one thing that still haunts me more than anything. Whoever it was wasn't interested in me getting away. They were waiting for the moment when I couldn't leave. And that, more than anything, is what still keeps me up at night. Posting this here feels strange, but the memory still sits heavy with me, and maybe someone out there will recognize pieces of it. At the time, my life was simple and a little worn around the edges, the kind of phase where quiet feels like a solution to everything. I had just bought a neglected rural farm through a county auction, drawn in by the low price and the promise of isolation. The listing described it as vacant for years, a forgotten patch of land with a farmhouse and an old barn leaning into the wind. I imagined slow mornings, manual work, and the kind of silence you can't buy in town. Friends thought it was impulsive, but impulsive felt better than stagnant. The drive out there was long and empty, gravel roads stretching farther than expected. By the time I unlocked the farmhouse door, the sun was already low, turning the fields dull and flat. The first hours were spent opening windows and pushing stale air out of the rooms. Dust coated every surface, but not in the uniform way abandoned places usually collect it. Inside a bedroom closet, shirts still hung on mismatched hangers, sleeves stiff but not decayed. In the kitchen, canned food lined a shelf, labels faded but intact, some arranged with a care that didn't match abandonment. A notebook sat on the table, pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates from only a few months earlier. That detail caught my attention more than anything else, because the auction paperwork claimed no one had lived there in years. I walked room to room, noticing small things that felt paused rather than left behind. A chair angled toward a window, a pair of work boots by the door, a half-used bar of soap. None of it fit the story I had been sold. As evening settled in, the property took on a different tone. Sounds carried farther than expected, each creak of wood snapping sharp in the open air. While unloading tools from my truck, a dull thud echoed from the barn, deep and hollow. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scramble either. It sounded deliberate, like weight shifting. I stood still, listening, counting my breaths without meaning to. The barn doors were shut, chained the way I'd left them earlier. When I walked closer, the smell of hay and damp earth grew stronger, and the noise stopped completely. That silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Later that night, curiosity won out over caution. With a flashlight in hand, I crossed the yard again, beam cutting through tall grass and catching movement that turned out to be nothing at all. Near the barn, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, clear and sharp, leading away from the doors toward the farmhouse. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. The prints followed a path I had walked earlier, then veered off, circling back toward the house. Standing there, I felt exposed in a way that's hard to explain, like the land itself was watching. I locked every door when I went back inside, double-checking each one, even though I knew it wouldn't change much. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sense that the house wasn't as empty as it claimed to be. Morning light didn't bring the relief I expected. The house looked ordinary again, almost harmless, but the details from the night before refused to fade. Over coffee made with bottled water, I went through the notebook I'd found, reading the entries slowly. The writing jumped between mundane notes about chores and sharper comments about noises, doors left open, and shadows near the tree line. One page mentioned someone entering the barn repeatedly, always after dark, always leaving no trace by morning. That conflicted with the official records I'd reviewed before buying the place, so I drove into the nearest town to ask questions. The county office was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of old paper. When I mentioned the farm, the clerk paused longer than necessary before answering. According to public records, the previous owners had left abruptly, citing safety concerns that never made it into formal complaints. No police reports, no inspections, no follow-up visits. It was treated like a quiet relocation, the kind rural families make without explanation. An older man waiting behind me leaned in and said he remembered lights moving across that land late at night, long after it was supposed to be empty. He shrugged it off as trespassers or kids looking for trouble, but his voice lacked conviction. Driving back, I noticed tire tracks near the fence line that hadn't been there the day before. They stopped short of the road as if someone preferred not to be seen coming or going. By the time I reached the house, the sense of being observed had returned. That afternoon, I focused on clearing brush around the barn, trying to ground myself in physical work. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint smell of sweat and old fabric. In a corner stall, I found a blanket folded neatly, still holding the shape of recent use. There were food wrappers tucked behind a beam, the kind you'd eat in a hurry, trying not to make noise. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to match an abandoned property. As the sun dipped again, the same sounds returned, footsteps shifting above the hayloft. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly against wood and metal, and the movement stopped immediately. Night fell faster than I wanted it to. From the farmhouse window, I saw a light flicker in the barn, faint but unmistakable. This time I didn't approach blindly. I grabbed my truck keys and headlights swept the yard as I drove closer, flooding the space with harsh white beams. The barn stood open, doors wide, chain cut clean through. No one was inside, but the footprints were there again, leading straight back toward the house. I didn't stay to search further. I left the property before midnight, drove until my hands steadied on the wheel, and didn't return until days later with help. The farm was sold again soon after, quietly, and I never learned who had been living there, or why they stopped the moment I showed up. Returning to the property days later felt different, like crossing into a place that no longer wanted me there. I brought a friend with me, someone practical who didn't scare easily, and we walked the land in daylight. The farmhouse looked unchanged, but the barn told another story. Inside, the blanket was gone, the wrappers vanished, and the loft was swept clean as if someone had taken care to erase themselves. Even the footprints had been smoothed out, dirt dragged flat with something heavy. My friend tried to laugh it off, suggested squatters who got nervous once the place sold. The explanation sounded thin even as he said it. Nothing about the cleanup felt rushed or careless. We spent hours checking every structure, every shed, every line of fence. Near the far edge of the property, hidden behind tall weeds, we found a narrow footpath leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map, worn down just enough to suggest repeated use. Along the trail were small signs of life: a crushed soda can, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, boot marks half filled with dirt. Whoever used it knew how to move without leaving much behind. Standing there, I realized how easy it would be to watch the house from that spot, to wait until lights went out. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like exposure instead. That night I stayed in a motel in town instead of the farmhouse. Sleep came easier there, but my thoughts kept circling back to the notebook and those recent dates. The idea that someone had been living alongside the myth of abandonment unsettled me more than any noise. It wasn't a ghost story or some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Someone had been there, close enough to hear footsteps, close enough to know routines, and careful enough to vanish when attention arrived. The county never followed up, and no one seemed interested in reopening the past. Silence, I learned, can be a form of protection in small places. In the end, I made a practical choice. I listed the farm and sold it without ever spending another night there. I never mentioned the belongings or the footprints, just said the land wasn't the right fit. Sometimes I still think about whoever lived in those shadows and why they stopped when I appeared. Maybe they moved on to another forgotten place, or maybe they learned to stay hidden better. I don't know, and that's the part that lingers. The farm taught me that isolation doesn't always mean empty, and that some spaces remember people long after the records forget them. Moving into that house marked the start of a quieter chapter of my life, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I had just inherited a small place tucked far from any city, surrounded by fields that rolled on longer than my patience for traffic ever had. My days back then were simple: remote work in the mornings, unpacking boxes in the afternoons, and long walks at dusk to clear my head. The town itself looked like something preserved on purpose. One main road, a few aging storefronts and houses spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I told people online I was craving isolation, but the truth was I needed distance from everything that had piled up behind me. The house wasn't special: creaky floors, outdated cabinets, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Still, it felt like a reset button I desperately wanted to press. The locals made a point of introducing themselves within my first few days, always polite, always brief. Names slipped out of my head quickly, but faces didn't, especially the way some of them lingered longer than necessary when we spoke. Conversations followed the same pattern: questions about how long I planned to stay, whether I worked from home, and what time I usually turned in at night. At first, I chalked it up to small-town curiosity, the kind people warn you about but never really explain. Every wave from across the road felt practiced, synchronized even. One woman, Rachel, who lived 2 houses down, casually mentioned she noticed my porch light stayed on late. She said it with a laugh, but it landed heavier than she probably intended. It didn't take long before people started commenting on my movements before I ever brought them up. Someone at the general store asked if my morning walks helped with sleep, even though I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Another neighbor suggested I avoid certain back roads once the sun dipped too low, offering no reason beyond a shrug and a vague warning tone. The strangest part wasn't the advice itself, but how consistent it was, as if everyone had rehearsed the same lines. Each evening, I caught glimpses of figures lingering near fences or parked trucks that hadn't been there moments before. Curtains across the street shifted whenever my front door opened. I started varying my routine without telling anyone, just to see if the comments would stop. They didn't. The first real crack in my sense of safety came quietly, almost easy to miss. A kitchen drawer I knew I had closed sat open when I returned from a short drive. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and the locks were exactly as I'd left them. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Small things out of place, a chair angled differently, a window unlatched but not forced. When I mentioned it at the local station, the officer listened with a thin patience that felt rehearsed. He suggested stress, settling in nerves, and reminded me that people here respected privacy. Walking back home, I noticed the same parked truck at the edge of my driveway that had been there earlier. Engine cold, tires dusty. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being monitored. Sleep became fragmented after that, not because of noise, but because of the silence pressing in on me. At night, the house made sounds I couldn't quite place, soft shifts that didn't belong to old wood settling. I started leaving objects exactly where I could remember them, down to the angle of a mug handle or the position of a rug corner. More than once, I woke to find those details altered by morning. The air inside the house sometimes carried a faint scent that wasn't mine, like unfamiliar soap or cold fabric pulled from storage. When I asked Rachel if she ever had issues with people wandering onto her property, she paused longer than usual before answering. She told me everyone looks out for each other here, and that I should be grateful for the attention. The sense of being managed rather than protected grew stronger as days passed. People would appear when I returned home, as if alerted the moment my tires hit the gravel. One man I'd never spoken to greeted me by name while leaning against my mailbox, commenting on how late I was compared to usual. I asked how he knew, and he smiled like I'd asked something naive. He said routines matter in places like this, that predictability keeps things peaceful. That word stuck with me, peaceful, because nothing about the way he said it felt calm. It sounded more like a rule than a reassurance. I tried pushing back in small ways, staying out longer, taking different routes, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using. The reactions came quickly. A note appeared on my porch one evening, written in careful block letters, warning me about roads I didn't need to test. Another time, someone knocked just after dark to tell me my back window had been open earlier, even though I'd been home all day. When I mentioned the notes and visits to the authorities again, the response was polite but firm. They said newcomers often misread community concern, and that stirring things up wouldn't help me settle in. The message was clear without being spoken outright. Isolation crept in next, heavy and deliberate. Phone calls dropped unexpectedly, internet outages became frequent, and my requests for repairs were delayed without explanation. I stopped receiving mail altogether for a stretch, even though I saw the delivery truck pass by. The house felt smaller with each passing night, like the walls were inching closer in agreement with the town. I realized then that leaving wasn't just discouraged, it was expected if I couldn't adapt. Outsiders didn't challenge the rhythm here. They either learned it or disappeared from it, and for the first time since arriving, I understood that the house wasn't the thing I'd inherited. It was the test. The turning point came late in the afternoon, when I returned from a supply run and found the front door unlocked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the handle, replaying every movement of my hands before I'd left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the house carried that same unfamiliar scent again, stronger this time. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. It wasn't threatening, not directly. It simply listed times, my usual departure, my return, when lights went out. At the bottom, one sentence was written smaller than the rest, reminding me that life runs smoother when everyone agrees on the order of things. I didn't bother calling the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag with only what I could carry: clothes, documents, my laptop, and a few personal items that still felt like mine. As dusk settled in, cars passed my house slower than usual, headlights lingering on the windows. Someone knocked once, firm but unhurried, then walked away when I didn't answer. I stayed still on the living room floor, breathing shallow, listening to footsteps circle the house without ever rushing. It wasn't fear that pinned me there. It was clarity. This place wasn't dangerous in the way people expect. It was organized, and I wasn't part of the system. When night fully set in, I slipped out through the back, walking across the fields instead of using the driveway. The land dipped and rose in uneven waves, my shoes soaking through with dew. Behind me, I could hear distant engines starting, doors closing, but no one shouted or chased. They didn't need to. By the time I reached the main road, my legs burned and my phone had no signal, but the silence finally felt empty instead of watched. I flagged down a passing truck hours later and didn't explain much, only that I needed a ride far away. The driver didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. I never went back for the rest of my things. Weeks later, I received a single forwarded envelope at a temporary address, containing the house keys and a short note thanking me for understanding how things work there. No return address, no signature. I sold the property without setting foot on it again, accepted a price far lower than it was worth, and considered it a fair trade. Sometimes I still catch myself tracking routines out of habit, checking windows twice, listening too closely. I don't talk about that town out loud, but I know this much for sure. Some places don't want you harmed, they just want you compliant.